Hey guys, tonight we begin with Victorian beauty standards that literally killed women. They poisoned themselves with arsenic, starved themselves with vinegar, and crushed their organs in corsets, all to look sick, pale, and dying, because somehow that became the height of feminine beauty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. What if I told you that in the 1800s, women were deliberately ingesting arsenic to make their skin translucent and pale? That they were dropping lemon juice and belladonna directly into their eyes to make their pupils dilate like they were dying? That they were drinking vinegar by the glassful to suppress their appetites and make themselves appear consumptive? What if you discovered that the ideal Victorian woman looked like she was suffering from tuberculosis, pale, thin, with flushed cheeks and glassy eyes, and that women who were naturally healthy had to artificially create the appearance of terminal illness to be considered beautiful? What if you learned that the corsets women wore weren't just uncomfortable fashion statements, but instruments of deliberate organ damage that caused women to faint, vomit, and struggle to breathe, and that this suffering was considered not just acceptable but desirable, proof of feminine delicacy and refinement? Tonight you are going to discover the truth about Victorian beauty standards and the horrifying lengths women went to in order to achieve the look of beautiful death. You are going to learn about the specific poisons they consumed, the devices they used to torture their bodies, the medical conditions they romanticized and tried to replicate through self-harm. You are going to meet real Victorian women whose beauty routines killed them, whose pursuit of the perfect pale complexion led to organ failure, whose desire to have the tiny waist of a consumptive led to crushed ribs and displaced organs. And you are going to understand how society convinced women that pain, illness, and self-destruction were the price of beauty, and that suffering gracefully was the ultimate expression of femininity. According to research by Professor Lois Banner from the University of Southern California, whose work examines beauty standards throughout American and European history, the Victorian ideal of feminine beauty was fundamentally based on the appearance of illness and fragility. Professor Banner's analysis of fashion magazines, medical texts, beauty manuals, and personal diaries from the 19th century reveals that women were explicitly told that robust health was unfeminine, that rosy cheeks from outdoor activity were vulgar, that any sign of physical strength or vigor made a woman appear common and unrefined. The ideal woman, according to Victorian beauty standards, looked ethereal, otherworldly, as if she might fade away at any moment, and women used any means necessary to achieve this deathly appearance. Think about what this means. You are going to spend tonight exploring a world where being healthy made you ugly, where looking like you were dying of tuberculosis was the beauty standard, where women deliberately harmed themselves in ways that modern people would recognize as self-destructive mental illness, but that Victorian society celebrated as proper feminine beauty care. This wasn't a fringe movement or an extreme subculture. This was mainstream beauty advice given to respectable middle and upper class women, published in widely read magazines, recommended by doctors and beauty experts, and practiced by millions of women across Europe and America. Let me tell you about arsenic complexion wafers, because this product illuminates the extreme measures Victorian women took for pale skin and the deadly consequences of beauty standards that valued appearance over health. According to research by Professor Carolyn Day from Furman University, whose work examines Victorian health and beauty culture, arsenic-based beauty products were widely available and heavily marketed to women in the 19th century. These wafers, small edible discs containing arsenic compounds, were sold with promises that they would give women the pale, translucent complexion that was considered the height of beauty, and thousands of women consumed them regularly, despite knowing, or at least suspecting, that arsenic was poisonous. Professor Day's research reveals that arsenic wafers like Dr. Mackenzie's improved harmless arsenic complexion wafers were advertised in major newspapers and magazines, with testimonials from women claiming miraculous results. The advertisements promised that arsenic would eliminate freckles, clear blemishes, create a delicate translucent pallor, and give skin an ethereal quality that no amount of powder could replicate. The recommended dosage was typically 1 to 3 wafers per Dalton Y, and women who wanted faster results often took more, ignoring or dismissing symptoms of arsenic poisoning as temporary side effects worth enduring for beauty. According to Professor Day, what made arsenic particularly appealing was that it actually did produce visible results. But these results were symptoms of poisoning, not beauty enhancement. Arsenic causes the skin to become pale and slightly translucent because it interferes with hemoglobin production and blood circulation. It can make eyes appear larger and more luminous because it causes fluid retention and slight swelling. It suppresses appetite, leading to weight loss and the thin, fragile appearance that was idealized. All of these effects were genuine, which is why women believed the products worked and continued using them despite mounting evidence of harm. Think about what arsenic poisoning actually does to the body. According to medical research analysed by Professor Day, chronic arsenic exposure causes nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle weakness, hair loss, skin lesions, nerve damage, and eventually organ failure. Women taking arsenic wafers experienced these symptoms but often attributed them to other causes or considered them acceptable prices to pay for beauty. When women's hair began falling out, they were told it was nerves or stress. When they experienced digestive problems, they were told it was feminine delicacy. When they felt weak and dizzy, they were praised for their ethereal, otherworldly appearance. The symptoms of poisoning were reframed as desirable feminine qualities. Professor Day's research reveals specific cases of women who died from arsenic poisoning that was initially attributed to natural causes or mysterious illnesses. In 1878, a young woman named Mary Burroughs died in London after years of using arsenic complexion wafers. The inquest revealed that her organs contained massive amounts of arsenic, and testimony from her friends indicated that she had been taking the wafers daily for over 3 years, sometimes exceeding the recommended dose when she wanted to look particularly pale for social events. Her death was ruled accidental poisoning, but the manufacturer of the wafers faced no consequences and continued selling the product with only minor changes to the labeling. According to Professor Day, what is particularly disturbing is that some women continued using arsenic products even after learning they were poisonous, because the alternative, accepting their natural complexion and being considered less beautiful, was worse than the risk of death. Beauty manuals acknowledged that arsenic was dangerous but suggested that careful use under medical supervision might be acceptable, and some doctors actually prescribed arsenic preparations for beauty purposes, arguing that small doses were beneficial despite medical evidence to the contrary. Now, let me tell you about the vinegar diet, because this practice reveals how Victorian women were willing to damage their digestive systems and overall health in pursuit of the thin, consumptive appearance that was idealized. According to research by Professor Joan Jacobs Brumberg from Cornell University, whose work examines the history of eating disorders and body image, drinking vinegar to suppress appetite and create a pale, thin appearance was common practice among fashionable Victorian women, and the practice was openly discussed in women's magazines and beauty manuals as a legitimate beauty technique. Professor Brumberg's research reveals that vinegar was believed to thin the blood and create the pale, translucent complexion associated with consumption tuberculosis, and that it suppressed appetite so effectively that women could achieve the extremely thin physique that was fashionable without the discomfort of constant hunger. The typical regimen involved drinking a glass of vinegar diluted in water before each meal, or in more extreme cases, drinking straight vinegar throughout the day to maintain constant appetite suppression. Some beauty manuals recommended adding honey or sugar to make the vinegar more palatable, but emphasized that the vinegar must be genuine distilled vinegar, not the milder vinegars used in cooking. According to Professor Bromberg, the vinegar diet was particularly popular among young women preparing for their social debut or for the marriage market because it produced rapid weight loss and created the fragile, ethereal appearance that was considered most attractive in marriageable young ladies. Women's diaries and letters from the period described drinking vinegar for weeks or months before important social seasons, enduring the nausea, stomach pain, and weakness it caused because the results, dramatic weight loss, pale skin, and a delicate appearance, were worth the suffering. Think about what drinking vinegar regularly does to the digestive system. According to medical research examined by Professor Bromberg, consuming large amounts of vinegar erodes tooth enamel, damages the esophagus and stomach lining, interferes with nutrient absorption, can cause potassium depletion leading to muscle weakness and heart problems, and in extreme cases can cause esophageal perforation or severe metabolic acidosis. Women drinking vinegar for beauty purposes experienced all of these effects, though they were often attributed to feminine delicacy, nervous disorders, or the stress of social obligations, rather than to the deliberate poisoning they were inflicting on themselves. Professor Bromberg's research reveals that doctors in the Victorian era were aware that the vinegar diet was harmful and occasionally wrote medical journal articles warning against it, but the practice continued because it was effective at producing the desired appearance and because women's health concerns were often dismissed or minimized. When women complained of digestive problems, they were told to rest more or given opiates to manage the pain, but they were rarely told to stop the beauty practices causing the problems, and many women, even when they knew the vinegar diet was harmful, continued the practice because the alternative, being considered fat or healthy, looking and therefore unfashionable and unmarriageable, was unacceptable. Let me tell you about belladonna eye drops, because this practice illuminates the literal blindness women were willing to risk for beauty. According to research by Professor Roy Porter from the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine, whose work examines Victorian medical culture, women regularly dropped juice from belladonna, deadly nightshades, directly into their eyes to dilate their pupils and create the wide-eyed, luminous gaze that was associated with beauty, romance, and illness. The practice was so common that belladonna preparations were sold specifically for cosmetic use, and beauty manuals included detailed instructions on how to prepare and apply the drops for maximum effect. Professor Porter's research reveals that belladonna, whose name literally means beautiful lady in Italian, was understood to be poisonous, but the cosmetic effects were considered worth the risk. Belladonna causes pupil dilation by blocking acetylcholine receptors in the eye, creating the appearance of large, dark, luminous eyes that Victorian beauty standards associated with passion, sensitivity, and the heightened emotional state of illness. Women applied belladonna drops before social events, before being photographed, before meeting potential suitors, or any time they wanted to appear particularly beautiful and alluring. According to Professor Porter, the effects of belladonna were immediate and dramatic. Within minutes of application, pupils would dilate to 2 or 3 times their normal size, creating the wide-eyed look that was fashionable, but the effects were also medically dangerous. Belladonna causes blurred vision, light sensitivity, inability to focus, increased eye pressure that can trigger glaucoma, and in cases of overuse or systemic absorption can cause rapid heartbeat, fever, hallucinations, seizures, and death. Women using belladonna drops regularly experienced vision problems, headaches, and eye pain, but these were considered acceptable side effects of beauty enhancement. Professor Porter's research includes specific cases of women who suffered permanent vision damage or blindness from belladonna use. In one case from 1882, a young woman named Elizabeth Marsh developed acute glaucoma after regular use of belladonna drops for cosmetic purposes, and despite treatment by multiple physicians, lost most of her vision in both eyes by age 26. Her case was published in a medical journal as a warning against cosmetic belladonna use, but the practice continued largely unchanged, and manufacturers continued selling belladonna preparations for beauty purposes with only minimal warnings about potential side effects. Think about what it means that women were willing to risk blindness for beauty. The dilated pupils created by belladonna were temporary. They returned to normal within hours, so women who wanted to maintain the effect had to use the drops repeatedly, day after day, increasing their exposure to the toxin and their risk of permanent damage. And they did this knowing it was dangerous, knowing women had gone blind from the practice, because large, luminous eyes were such an important part of the beauty ideal that the risk seemed worth taking. Now let me tell you about tight lacing and extreme corsetry, because while corsets themselves were standard Victorian garments, the practice of tight lacing to achieve impossibly small waists represents another form of deliberate self-harm in pursuit of beauty. According to research by Professor Valerie Steele from the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, whose work examines the history of corsetry, tight lacing, the practice of wearing corsets laced so tightly that they restricted breathing, compressed organs, and caused significant pain was controversial even in the Victorian era, but was practiced by women who wanted to achieve the 16 to 18-inch waists that were idealized in fashion illustrations and celebrated as the pinnacle of feminine beauty. Professor Steele's research reveals that not all Victorian women tight-laced. Most wore corsets that provided support and shaping, but were laced comfortably enough to allow breathing and movement. But fashion-conscious women, particularly young women in wealthy families who wanted to make impressive social debuts, often pushed corsetry to dangerous extremes, progressively lacing tighter and tighter to achieve waist measurements that were medically harmful. The process of achieving an extremely small waist typically began in adolescence, with girls being gradually accustomed to tighter and tighter lacing over months or years, training their bodies to compress into unnatural shapes. According to Professor Steele, extreme tight lacing caused a cascade of medical problems. The immediate effects included restricted breathing, inability to engage in physical activity, digestive problems, and frequent fainting spells. Victorian women who tight-laced were known for their vapours and constant need for smelling salts to revive them from fainting episodes. These weren't mysterious feminine ailments, but direct results of insufficient oxygen from compressed lungs and restricted blood flow from compressed blood vessels. Women literally couldn't breathe properly, and the fainting and weakness this caused were considered proof of feminine delicacy rather than evidence of self-inflicted harm. The long-term effects of extreme tight lacing were even worse. Professor Steele's analysis of Victorian medical records and skeletal remains reveals that women who tight-laced for years developed permanently deformed rib cages, with the lower ribs compressed inward and sometimes overlapping. They suffered from displaced organs, stomachs, livers, and intestines pushed downward into the pelvic cavity, causing chronic digestive problems, reproductive issues, and constant pain. They experienced muscle atrophy in the core muscles that were no longer needed because the corset provided all structural support, and they had increased rates of prolapsed uterus, hemorrhoids, and other conditions related to the constant downward pressure on the pelvic floor. Think about what it means that women deformed their skeletons and displaced their organs for beauty. This wasn't temporary discomfort that went away when the corset came off. This was permanent bodily damage that affected women's health for the rest of their lives, and they began this process in childhood or adolescence, before they were old enough to truly understand the long-term consequences, because society told them that having a tiny waist was essential to being attractive, marriageable, and socially successful. According to Professor Steele's research, there were Victorian reform movements that opposed tight lacing and promoted more rational dress for women, But these movements were often dismissed as radical or unfeminine, and women who wore looser clothing were considered either lower class, bohemian, or insufficiently concerned with their appearance. The social pressure to tight lace was intense enough that many women continued the practice, despite experiencing constant pain, despite medical advice to stop, despite knowing the long-term damage they were causing. Let me tell you about the romanticization of tuberculosis and how this deadly disease became a beauty standard that women tried to replicate. According to research by Professor Carolyn Day, tuberculosis, called consumption in the Victorian era, killed more people than any other disease in the 19th century. But it was also romanticized as a beautiful death that gave sufferers an ethereal, refined appearance. The typical consumption victim became pale and thin, developed flushed cheeks and bright eyes from fever, lost weight progressively, creating a delicate, fragile silhouette, and exhibited a heightened emotional sensitivity and creativity that was attributed to the disease. And tragically, this appearance of dying from consumption became the beauty ideal that healthy women tried to achieve. Professor Day's research reveals that the romanticization of consumption was driven partly by the fact that it disproportionately affected young people, particularly young women from middle and upper classes who had the close indoor living conditions and lifestyle that facilitated the disease's spread. Famous beauties and tragic heroines who died young from consumption, like Keats' beloved Fanny Brawne, like the Bront sisters, like countless opera heroines in La Traviata and La Bourfimée, created a cultural association between consumption, beauty, tragedy, and romantic death. To look consumptive was to look like a tragic heroine, refined and spiritual, rather than coarse and material. According to Professor Day, beauty manuals and fashion magazines explicitly advised women to cultivate the consumptive look: pale skin, bright eyes, flushed cheeks, extreme thinness, languorous movements, and an air of fragile delicacy. The vinegar diet, arsenic complexion, wafers, belladonna eye drops, and extreme tight lacing were all partly motivated by the desire to replicate the appearance of consumption. Women who were naturally healthy and robust used these methods to suppress their vigor and create the appearance of beautiful illness. Women who actually had consumption were sometimes praised for their beautiful appearance, even as they were dying. And in some perverse cases, women envied consumption victims for achieving naturally what they had to create. Think about how twisted this is: a deadly disease that killed hundreds of thousands of people annually, that caused victims to cough up blood, suffer from night sweats, waste away over months or years, and die painful deaths, was romanticized to the point that healthy people tried to look like they had it. Women who weren't dying were considered less beautiful than women who were. The appearance of terminal illness became the beauty standard, and women poisoned and starved themselves to achieve it. Professor Day's research includes heartbreaking examples of women who actually did develop tuberculosis, and described in their diaries and letters the strange experience of being told they looked beautiful as they were dying, of having friends and acquaintances envy their pale, thin appearance even as they coughed blood and struggled to breathe. One woman's diary from 1854 describes being complimented on her ethereal beauty and refined pallor at a social event where she had to excuse herself repeatedly to cough up blood in private. She wrote that she found the compliments both absurd and deeply disturbing. She was dying, and people thought she looked beautiful because of it. Now let me tell you about chlorosis, or green sickness, and how this nutritional deficiency disorder was romanticized and deliberately induced by some Victorian women. According to research by Professor Helen King from the Open University, whose work examines the history of women's diseases, chlorosis was a condition primarily affecting adolescent girls and young women, characterized by severe anemia, greenish pallor, weakness, irregular menstruation, and various digestive complaints. Modern medicine recognizes chlorosis as iron deficiency anemia, typically caused by inadequate nutrition, during periods of rapid growth and menstruation, but Victorian medicine treated it as a mysterious disorder specific to young women and associated it with feminine delicacy and sexual maturation. Professor King's research reveals that chlorosis was simultaneously a real medical condition that made women seriously ill and a romanticized illness that was associated with virginity, sensitivity, and feminine refinement. Young women with chlorosis were described in medical and popular literature as ethereal, otherworldly, delicate creatures too refined for earthly existence. And this romanticization led some women to deliberately restrict their diets in ways that induced chlorotic symptoms, because the appearance was considered beautiful, and the condition was associated with upper-class refinement, rather than with the robust health of working-class women. According to Professor King, the standard Victorian treatment for chlorosis was iron supplementation, red meat, port wine, and outdoor exercise. Essentially, the exact opposite of the beauty practices that caused or worsened the condition. But many young women resisted this treatment because it would make them appear healthier and more robust, which was considered unfeminine and unattractive. They preferred to remain pale, weak, and chlorotic because it fit the beauty ideal, even though the condition caused them significant suffering and could have serious long-term health consequences, including heart problems and increased susceptibility to other diseases. Professor King's research includes the case of a young woman named Charlotte Benson, whose doctor's notes from 1868 describe her as suffering from severe chlorosis with dangerously low hemoglobin levels, but as repeatedly refusing to follow his treatment recommendations because she didn't want to gain weight or develop the healthy colour that proper nutrition would bring. Her mother supported her refusal, believing that Charlotte's pale, delicate appearance made her more attractive to potential suitors. Charlotte eventually agreed to treatment only after she became so weak she couldn't participate in social activities. But even then, she stopped treatment as soon as she regained enough strength to function, preferring to maintain her pallor rather than fully recover. Think about what it means that women preferred to be anemic rather than healthy, that they refused medical treatment for a serious condition because health was considered ugly. Chlorosis caused fatigue, heart palpitations, difficulty breathing, headaches, and sometimes serious cardiac complications. But women endured these symptoms because the alternative, looking healthy and vigorous, was socially unacceptable. The disease was romanticized to the point that having it was considered more desirable than not having it. Let me tell you about lead-based cosmetics and how Victorian women continued using makeup that they knew was poisoning them because the immediate beautifying effects outweighed the long-term health consequences. According to research by Professor Jessica Clark from the University of Glasgow, whose work examines Victorian cosmetics and beauty culture, lead-based face powders, creams, and paints were standard products in Victorian beauty regimens, despite widespread knowledge that lead was poisonous. These products provided coverage and whitening effects that no other available substances could match, and women used them extensively, despite experiencing symptoms of lead poisoning, including digestive problems, nerve damage, and cognitive decline. Professor Clark's research reveals that lead cosmetics had been used for centuries before the Victorian era, and the dangers were well documented. There were medical treatises from the 17th and 18th centuries describing lead poisoning from cosmetics. There were famous cases of women who had died from lead-based makeup, and Victorian chemistry was advanced enough that the toxic nature of lead compounds was well understood. But lead cosmetics remained popular throughout the 19th century because they worked so well. They created a smooth, matte porcelain, white complexion that women couldn't achieve with safer alternatives like rice powder or zinc oxide. According to Professor Clark, the most dangerous lead cosmetic was Venetian cerus, also called spirits of Saturn, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that was applied to the face, neck, and chest to create a flawless white complexion. Women applied cerus as a thick paste, sometimes building up multiple layers to cover blemishes and create a mask like perfection. The serous was left on for hours or sometimes days, during which lead was absorbed through the skin, causing chronic poisoning. Long-term serous users developed characteristic symptoms: muscle weakness, abdominal pain, paralysis, cognitive impairment, and eventually organ failure. Professor Clark's research includes the case of Maria Gunning, Countess of Coventry, who died in 1760 at age 27 from lead poisoning caused by her extensive use of serous and other lead-based cosmetics. Her case was widely publicized and supposedly led to reduced use of lead cosmetics for a brief period. But by the Victorian era, lead cosmetics were again widely available and heavily used. Victorian women knew about the Countess of Coventry's death and similar cases, but many continued using lead cosmetics anyway, reasoning that they would use less than the Countess had, or that the beautifying effects were worth the risk, or simply that they couldn't achieve the desired appearance without lead-based products. Think about the calculation women were making. They knew lead cosmetics were poisonous, knew they caused horrible deaths, knew that every application brought them closer to poisoning, but they used them anyway because appearing beautiful in the short term was more important than staying healthy in the long term. And society supported this calculation by valuing women primarily for their appearance, by making marriage and social status dependent on beauty, by creating conditions where women who weren't beautiful had limited options and difficult lives. According to Professor Clark, Victorian advertisements for cosmetics explicitly acknowledged the dangers of lead while claiming that their particular formulation was safer than competitors' products, or that small amounts of lead were actually beneficial, or that proper use under careful supervision eliminated the risks. These claims were false. There is no safe level of lead exposure, and the cosmetics contained dangerous amounts regardless of manufacturer claims. But they allowed women to rationalize continued use. If this particular brand of lead powder claimed to be safe, women could tell themselves they were being responsible by choosing it, even though they were still poisoning themselves. Now, let me tell you about tapeworm diet pills and the extreme measures some Victorian and Edwardian women took for weight loss. According to research by Professor Louise Foxcroft from Oxford University, whose work examines the history of dieting and obesity, by the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, deliberate ingestion of tapeworm larvae to achieve weight loss was practiced by some women, and products claiming to contain tapeworms or tapeworm eggs were advertised in newspapers and sold through the mail. While the extent of this practice is debated, many historians believe that most tapeworm pills were fraudulent and didn't actually contain tapeworms. There is documented evidence that some women did intentionally infect themselves with parasites for weight loss. Professor Foxcroft's research reveals that the appeal of the tapeworm diet was that it supposedly allowed women to eat normally while still losing weight, because the tapeworm would consume much of the nutrition from ingested food. Advertisements for tapeworm pills promised effortless weight loss without dietary restriction, and testimonials claimed dramatic results. The reality, of course, was that tapeworm infection caused malnutrition, abdominal pain, digestive problems, anemia, and potentially life-threatening complications if the parasite migrated to other organs, or if the infection became heavy. According to Professor Foxcroft, documented cases of deliberate tapeworm infection for weight loss include women who travelled to regions where tapeworms were endemic and deliberately consumed contaminated meat, or who obtained tapeworm larvae from medical sources and ingested them, or who purchased pills that allegedly contained tapeworms. One case from 1909 describes an American opera singer who deliberately infected herself with a beef tapeworm to lose weight before a performance season, succeeded in losing approximately 30 pounds over 3 months, and then required medical treatment to remove the parasite, which had grown to over 20 feet long. Think about what it means to deliberately infect yourself with a parasite to lose weight. Tapeworm infection isn't a gentle, controlled weight loss method. It is a serious parasitic disease that causes the host's body to be literally consumed by another organism. Women who chose this method knew it was dangerous and disgusting, But the social pressure to be thin was so intense that parasitic infection seemed like an acceptable option. The fact that this was even considered reveals how distorted Victorian and Edwardian beauty standards had become. Let me tell you about the role doctors played in enabling and sometimes actively promoting these harmful beauty practices. According to research by Professor Ornella Moscucci from Oxford Brookes University, whose work examines Victorian medical culture, many Victorian doctors prescribed or recommended beauty treatments that we would now recognise as medically harmful, either because they genuinely believed the treatments were beneficial, or because they prioritised women's beauty over women's health, or because they profited from selling beauty products and treatments. The medicalisation of beauty, the idea that doctors should supervise and manage women's appearance, created a system where harmful practices received medical authority and women's health concerns about beauty treatments were dismissed. Professor Moscucci's research reveals that Victorian doctors prescribed arsenic for complexion improvement, recommended restrictive diets that caused nutritional deficiencies, approved of tight lacing despite knowing it caused organ damage, and sold patent medicines and cosmetics that they knew or should have known were harmful. Some doctors genuinely believed that beauty and health were connected, and that treatments that enhanced beauty must therefore be healthy. Others prioritized the income they earned from wealthy female patients who wanted beauty treatments over their Hippocratic duty to do no harm, and many simply accepted the cultural assumption that women's primary value was in their appearance, and that health could be sacrificed for beauty. According to Professor Moscucci, there were Victorian doctors who opposed harmful beauty practices and wrote articles and books warning women against arsenic, lead cosmetics, extreme dieting, and tight lacing. But these reformist doctors were often dismissed as prudish, overly cautious, or insufficiently understanding of women's social needs. Women and their families argued that doctors who opposed beauty treatments didn't understand how important appearance was for women's marriage prospects and social success, and that a long, healthy life as an unmarried, socially unsuccessful woman was worse than a shorter life as a beautiful, married, socially successful woman. Professor Moscucci's research includes the case of a Victorian doctor named Robert Brudenell Carter, who published a scathing critique in 1853 of the medical profession's complicity in harmful beauty practices. He wrote that doctors who prescribed arsenic for complexion, approved extreme tight lacing, or recommended starvation diets for cosmetic purposes were violating their duty to patients and prioritizing profit over health. He was attacked in medical journals by other doctors who argued that women's beauty was a legitimate medical concern and that treatments that enhanced appearance provided psychological benefits that outweighed minor physical risks. Carter's reform efforts had little impact, and harmful beauty practices continued largely unchanged. Think about what it means that the medical profession, which should have protected women's health, instead often enabled their self-harm. Doctors had the authority and knowledge to refuse to participate in harmful beauty practices, to educate women about the dangers, to prioritize long-term health over short-term appearance. But many doctors instead profited from women's insecurity and society's valuation of beauty over health, prescribing and selling products and treatments that they knew or should have known were damaging their patients. Now let me tell you about the class dimensions of Victorian beauty practices and how these harmful standards were both enforced by class anxiety and used to signal class status. According to research by Professor Deborah Lutz from Long Island University, whose work examines Victorian material culture, the most extreme beauty practices are arsenic use, vinegar dieting, tight lacing to dangerous degrees. Extensive use of lead cosmetics were primarily practiced by middle and upper class women who had the resources to purchase beauty products, the leisure time to maintain elaborate beauty regimens, and the social pressure to compete in marriage and social markets where appearance was crucial. Working class women who couldn't afford expensive beauty products and whose work required physical strength and endurance generally didn't engage in these practices to the same degree. Professor Lutz's research reveals that pale, fragile beauty was explicitly associated with upper-class status. It signaled that a woman didn't have to work outdoors, didn't engage in physical labour, was sheltered and protected, and came from a family wealthy enough to support an economically unproductive but beautiful daughter. Women who had tanned skin from outdoor work, muscular builds from physical labour, or robust health from adequate nutrition were marked as lower class, regardless of their actual economic status. And middle-class women who were climbing socially went to extreme lengths to avoid any sign of working-class vigour or health. According to Professor Lutz, this created a situation where women's beauty practices were driven partly by class anxiety and competition. A middle-class woman who wanted to marry up or maintain her family's social position needed to signal through her appearance that she belonged to a higher class, which meant achieving the pale, thin, fragile look that indicated she didn't need to work. For families with limited resources, investing in a daughter's beauty, purchasing arsenic wafers, expensive corsets, lead cosmetics, hiring beauty consultants was a financial strategy aimed at securing an advantageous marriage that would elevate or maintain the family's status. Professor Lutz's research includes examples of middle-class families spending significant portions of their income on beauty products and treatments for daughters of marriageable age, sometimes going into debt to present their daughters as successfully as wealthy families could. One family's account books from 1876 show that they spent nearly 30% of their annual income on their eldest daughter's clothing, corsets, beauty products, and related expenses during her debutante season, more than they spent on food for the entire family. This was considered a reasonable investment because a successful marriage to a wealthy man would repay the expense many times over. Think about what this reveals about Victorian society. Women's bodies were economic assets to be invested in and managed for maximum return, and the return was measured in marriage prospects and social position, not in the women's own health or happiness. Families calculated that the money spent on arsenic and corsets and beauty treatments was worth it if it resulted in an advantageous marriage, even if those treatments damaged their daughter's health or caused her suffering. Women themselves internalized this calculation and willingly suffered for beauty because they understood that their economic futures depended on their appearance. Let me tell you about the language used to describe and justify these beauty practices, because understanding the rhetoric reveals how society normalized self-harm and convinced women that damaging their health was acceptable and even virtuous. According to research by Professor Galia Offek from Brooklyn College, whose work examines Victorian beauty culture and aesthetics, beauty manuals and women's magazines used language that reframed harmful practices as forms of self-improvement, feminine duty, and even healthcare. Poisoning yourself with arsenic was described as complexion management. Starving yourself was cultivating delicacy, crushing your organs with tight. Lacing was achieving proper figure, and making yourself chronically ill was developing refinement. Professor Offek's research reveals that Victorian beauty discourse emphasized that beauty was a woman's duty, that failing to be beautiful was a form of selfishness or laziness, and that women who prioritized health over beauty were shirking their feminine obligations. Beauty manuals told women that they owed it to their families, to potential husbands, to society to be as beautiful as possible, and that suffering for beauty was noble self-sacrifice, rather than self-harm. The pain and illness caused by beauty practices were reframed as evidence of women's dedication and willingness to suffer for others' pleasure. Exactly the self-abnegation that Victorian feminine ideals celebrated. According to Professor Offek, beauty advice also used medical and scientific language to give harmful practices an aura of legitimacy and expertise. Products were advertised as scientifically formulated, recommended by physicians, based on the latest medical research. Beauty manuals cited bogus medical theories about the benefits of pallor or thinness, claimed that compression of the waist improved organ function, argued that arsenic in small doses was a health tonic. This pseudo-medical language made dangerous practices seem safe and reasonable, and made women who questioned them seem ignorant or hysterical. Professor of X research includes analysis of beauty manual rhetoric that blamed women for their appearance, while also insisting they could change it through proper effort and expense. Women were told they were naturally imperfect and needed extensive intervention to become beautiful, but also that beauty was their responsibility, and failing to achieve it was a moral failing. This created a psychological trap where women felt inadequate if they weren't beautiful, but also guilty if they prioritized their appearance too much, and the only escape was to suffer for beauty silently and gracefully, demonstrating feminine virtue through stoic endurance of self-inflicted harm. Think about how this language shaped women's understanding of what they were doing to themselves. When you are told that drinking vinegar is cultivating delicacy, rather than inducing malnutrition, when arsenic poisoning is framed as complexion management rather than slow suicide. When organ damage from tight lacing is described as achieving proper figure rather than permanent bodily harm, it becomes much easier to justify these practices to yourself and to ignore the evidence that you are hurting yourself. Language that euphemizes and romanticizes self-harm makes it possible for people to engage in destructive behaviors while thinking of themselves as responsible, virtuous, and well-behaved. Now, let me tell you about the long-term health consequences experienced by Victorian women who engaged in these beauty practices, because understanding what happened to their bodies reveals the true cost of beauty standards that valued appearance over health. According to research by Professor Patricia Wojtyński from the University of British Columbia, whose work examines women's health history, Victorian women who followed fashionable beauty practices had significantly worse health outcomes than women who resisted these practices or who couldn't afford to follow them. Analysis of medical records, death certificates, and skeletal remains from the Victorian era reveals high rates of anemia, osteoporosis, organ damage, dental problems, neurological disorders, and premature death among women from the classes that most intensively practiced fashionable beauty standards. Professor Wojtyński's research reveals that chronic arsenic exposure caused permanent nerve damage, liver and kidney disease, increased cancer risk, and cognitive impairment in women who used arsenic cosmetics long-term. Lead cosmetics caused similar problems plus bone loss and reproductive issues. Extreme dieting and the vinegar diet caused malnutrition disorders including scurvy, pellagra, and severe anemia, along with digestive damage and metabolic problems that persisted even if women later improved their nutrition. Tight lacing caused permanent skeletal deformation, chronic organ displacement and dysfunction, muscle atrophy, and increased rates of uterine prolapse and other pelvic floor disorders. According to Professor Wojtyński, the cumulative effect of multiple harmful beauty practices was even worse than the sum of individual effects. A woman who used arsenic and lead cosmetics, drank vinegar, tight-laced, and used belladonna eye drops wasn't just dealing with one health problem, but with a cascade of interconnected issues that undermined her overall health and shortened her life. Medical records show that fashionable Victorian women frequently suffered from vague chronic illnesses characterized by weakness, pain, digestive problems, and inability to function, symptoms that were attributed to feminine delicacy or hysteria, but that were actually caused by their beauty practices. Professor Wojtyński's research includes demographic analysis showing that upper-class Victorian women who had the resources to follow beauty standards most intensively had lower life expectancy than lower-class women who couldn't afford to poison and starve themselves. A working-class woman who ate adequately didn't tight-lace because her work required mobility, couldn't afford arsenic and lead cosmetics, and had sun exposure and exercise from her work, was likely to live longer and be healthier than her wealthier counterpart, who followed all the fashionable beauty advice. The very practices that were supposed to indicate upper-class refinement actually functioned as slow methods of suicide. Think about the tragic irony here. Women who had every advantage of wealth, education, and opportunity damaged their health and shortened their lives in pursuit of beauty standards that were specifically designed to demonstrate those advantages. The women who could afford the best food, the best medical care, the most comfortable living conditions, deliberately undermined their own health through beauty practices that their less wealthy sisters couldn't afford to follow. Privilege became a burden because it came with beauty standards that were literally deadly. According to Professor Vertinsky, Victorian women were not entirely unaware of the health consequences. Medical writings of the era document doctors' concerns. Women's diaries describe health problems they attributed to their beauty practices. And there were reform movements advocating for more rational dress and healthier beauty standards. But the social pressure to conform to beauty standards was so intense. The consequences of not being beautiful were so severe, and the cultural conditioning that women's value lay in their appearance was so thorough that most women continued practices they knew were harmful. They made rational choices within an irrational system, accepting that health damage was the price of beauty, because beauty was the price of everything else they wanted in life. Let me tell you about the women who resisted Victorian beauty standards and the social consequences they faced. According to research by Professor Sarah Grand from the University of Westminster, whose work examines Victorian feminism and women's reform movements, there were women throughout the Victorian era who rejected harmful beauty practices, who advocated for dress reform, who wrote and spoke against the beauty standards that were damaging women's health. These women including feminists, health reformers, some doctors, and women who simply refused to participate in self-harm, faced significant social backlash, and were often portrayed as unfeminine, unattractive, radical, and threatening to social order. Professor Grand's research reveals that women who wore rational dress, looser clothing, that didn't require tight lacing, who refused to use dangerous cosmetics, who maintained healthy weight rather than starving themselves to achieve fashionable thinness, were mocked in newspapers and magazines, excluded from fashionable society, considered unmarriageable, and dismissed as either too unattractive to achieve beauty or too radical to care about it. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, advocated for clothing that didn't exceed 7 pounds in weight and didn't restrict breathing or movement requirements that seemed minimal, but that required abandoning tight lacing and many fashionable styles. The society was viciously attacked in the press as promoting immodesty and unfemininity. According to Professor Grand, women reformers argued that beauty standards were tools of patriarchal control, that they kept women weak and sick and economically dependent, that they diverted women's energy and resources away from education and meaningful work, and that they needed to be challenged and changed. But these arguments were hard to make effectively when they were coming from women who were dismissed as ugly, unsuccessful, bitter, or man-hating. The beauty standard was so powerful that women who didn't meet it had no credibility to critique it. If you weren't beautiful, your opposition to beauty standards was attributed to sour grapes, rather than to genuine concern for women's welfare. Professor Grand's research includes the stories of individual women who paid high social prices for refusing to conform to beauty standards. One woman, a university-educated teacher named Eleanor Marks, refused to tight-lace or use cosmetics and advocated for dress reform and women's physical education. She was described in contemporary accounts as intelligent but regrettably plain, as someone who might have been marriageable if she had made more effort with her appearance, as wasting her advantages by not prioritizing beauty. In reality, Eleanor was healthy, active and successful in her career, but these achievements didn't compensate in society's eyes for her failure to achieve fashionable beauty. Think about the trap this created for women who wanted to resist harmful beauty standards. If you were beautiful and you criticized beauty standards, you were accused of hypocrisy. You had already benefited from your beauty, so your criticism wasn't taken seriously. If you weren't beautiful and you criticized beauty standards, you were accused of sour grapes. You were just bitter because you couldn't achieve beauty, so your criticism was dismissed as self-serving. There was no position from which women could effectively critique beauty standards, which is precisely how oppressive systems maintain themselves, by making it impossible to criticize them without being dismissed or delegitimized. Now, let me tell you about how these Victorian beauty practices connect to modern beauty standards, and what we can learn from this history. According to research by Professor Susan Bordeaux from the University of Kentucky, whose work examines body image and eating disorders, many of the patterns established by Victorian beauty culture persist in modern beauty standards. The association of thinness with upper-class status, the willingness to harm health for appearance, the use of potentially dangerous products and procedures for beautification, the framing of beauty as women's duty and failure to be beautiful as moral failing. All of these continue in various forms today. Professor Bordeaux's research reveals that modern women still engage in beauty practices that damage health: extreme dieting that causes malnutrition and eating disorders, cosmetic procedures that carry risks of complication and death, use of products with questionable ingredients, wearing uncomfortable clothing and shoes that cause pain and injure. Right. While we no longer drink arsenic or use lead cosmetics, we use Botox, a neurotoxin, undergo surgery to remove fat or implant foreign objects, take diet pills with dangerous side effects, and expose ourselves to UV radiation for tanning. The specific practices have changed, but the underlying pattern, sacrificing health for beauty, remains. According to Professor Bordeaux, the rhetoric around modern beauty practices also echoes Victorian patterns. Beauty treatments are framed as self-care and empowerment rather than as self-harm. Dangerous procedures are described with medical and scientific language to make them seem safe and legitimate, and women are told that beauty is a choice and a responsibility rather than an oppressive standard. The fact that these practices are freely chosen doesn't make them less harmful or less connected to oppressive beauty standards. Victorian women also freely chose to use arsenic and tight lace, but their choices were made within systems that severely limited their options and made beauty essential to their life prospects. Professor Bordeaux's research suggests that understanding Victorian beauty history can help us recognize parallel patterns in modern beauty culture. When we see modern beauty practices that cause health problems, that are marketed using medical language and authority, that women feel compelled to engage in despite knowing the risks, that are defended as free choice, despite operating within oppressive systems, we should recognize these as continuations of patterns established in the Victorian era. The specific practices change over time, but the underlying dynamic of women being pressured to sacrifice health for beauty remains remarkably consistent. Think about what this means for how you understand modern beauty standards and your own relationship to them. The Victorian women who drank arsenic and vinegar weren't stupid or ignorant. They were responding rationally to the beauty standards and social pressures of their time, just as modern women respond rationally to current standards and pressures. Understanding their choices doesn't mean judging them harshly, but rather recognizing how powerful and coercive beauty standards can be, how they can make harmful practices seem reasonable or necessary, and how we need to maintain critical awareness of beauty culture to avoid repeating historical patterns of beauty, motivated self-harm. Let me tell you about the specific beauty manuals and advice books that spread these harmful practices, and how they framed self-harm as scientific beauty care. According to research by Professor Kathy Pice from the University of Pennsylvania, whose work examines the history of the American beauty industry, popular beauty manuals like The Art of Beauty by Madame Lola Montez 1858, Beauty, Its Attainment and Preservation by J.H. Kellogg 1890, and countless advice columns in women's magazines provided detailed instructions for beauty practices that modern readers would recognize as deliberate poisoning and self-harm. These texts used medical and scientific language to give their advice authority, and they were widely read and followed by women seeking beauty guidance. Professor Pice's research reveals that Madame Lola Montez's beauty manual, one of the most popular of the era, included recipes for homemade arsenic complexion, treatments, detailed instructions for vinegar diets, including specific dosing schedules, advice on tight lacing, including how to progressively reduce waist measurements over time, and recommendations for various toxic substances to achieve desired beauty effects. The manual framed all of these practices as scientific methods based on understanding of chemistry and physiology, giving them an aura of legitimate expertise that made readers trust them despite the obvious dangers. According to Professor Pice, these beauty manuals typically included disclaimers stating that the author wasn't responsible if readers harmed themselves following the advice, but these warnings were buried in fine print, or phrased in ways that suggested the dangers came from misuse rather than from the practices themselves. Women reading these manuals absorbed the message that beauty required suffering, and that the specific harmful practices described were normal, accepted, scientific methods that any woman who wanted to be beautiful should follow. The manuals created a blueprint for self-harm that was distributed widely and followed religiously. Professor Pice's research includes analysis of the specific language these manuals used to normalize harmful practices. Instead of saying drink poison, they said take complexion wafers containing the beneficial tonic effects of arsenic. Instead of starve yourself, they said cultivate delicacy through refined dietary management. Instead of crush your organs, they said achieve proper figure through scientific corsetry. This euphemistic language made it possible for women to engage in obviously harmful behaviors while thinking of themselves as following scientific beauty advice, rather than as hurting themselves. Think about how powerful these beauty manuals were in shaping behavior. These weren't obscure texts read by a tiny fringe. They were bestsellers, widely advertised, given as gifts, passed from mother to daughter, consulted like medical references. Women trusted them because they used scientific language, because they claimed medical authority, because they were widely distributed and socially accepted. The manuals created a shared understanding of what beauty required and how to achieve it, and that understanding included accepting pain, illness, and poisoning as normal prices to pay for beauty. Now, let me tell you about the role of photography in intensifying Victorian beauty standards, and how the new technology of photographic portraiture created additional pressure for women to achieve the pale, consumptive look. According to research by Professor Nancy Armstrong from Duke University, whose work examines Victorian visual culture, the rise of portrait photography in the mid-negative 19th century created new anxieties about appearance, because photographs captured and preserved images in ways that paintings didn't, and because photographic processes of the era made healthy, ruddy complexions appear coarse and unattractive while pale, thin faces photographed as elegant and refined. Professor Armstrong's research reveals that early photographic processes, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and early paper photographs were more sensitive to certain colours and contrasts than others, and this had the effect of making pale skin appear luminous and beautiful in photographs, while tanned or ruddy skin appeared dark and coarse. Women who were naturally healthy, looking with good colour in their faces, looked worse in photographs than pale, anemic women. And since photographs were becoming important for social purposes, sent to potential suitors, displayed in homes, used to commemorate important events, women had incentive to achieve the pale look that photographed well, even if it made them look sickly in person. According to Professor Armstrong, photographers actively encouraged women to achieve the pale, thin aesthetic because it photographed better with available technology. Photography studios advertised their ability to make clients look refined and ethereal, which meant pale and delicate, and they advised women on how to prepare for portrait sessions, fasting to achieve a thin face, using powder to increase pallor, wearing light-coloured clothing that emphasized pale skin. Women learned that looking good in photographs required looking different from how they naturally appeared. And since photographs were becoming permanent records that would be viewed by many people, photographic appearance became as important or more important than in-person appearance. Professor Armstrong's research includes examples of women's letters and diary entries describing preparations for photographic portraits, fasting for days beforehand to make their faces appear thinner, using excessive powder to increase pallor, taking extra arsenic wafers or vinegar in the days before a sitting. One woman's 1869 diary describes fasting for 3 days before a portrait session because she wanted to achieve the spiritual appearance that her photographer had showed her in examples of his best work. She fainted during the sitting and had to reschedule, but she repeated the fasting regimen for the second session because she was determined to achieve the ideal photographic look. Think about how photography changed the stakes of beauty. Before photography, your appearance was transient. People saw you as you were in the moment, and memories faded and were unreliable. But photographs created permanent records that could be endlessly reproduced and shared, that captured you at your worst or best, and preserved that image forever. This created new pressure to achieve beauty that would last beyond the moment. And since photographic technology favoured the pale, thin aesthetic, it reinforced and intensified the existing beauty standards that were already harmful. Let me tell you about the beauty industry that grew up around these harmful practices, and how commercialization intensified the pressure on women to engage in dangerous beauty behaviors. According to research by Professor Jeffrey Jones from Harvard Business School, whose work examines the history of the global beauty industry, the 19th century saw the emergence of commercial beauty products and services on an unprecedented scale, with manufacturers and advertisers developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for creating demand for beauty products, including many that were actively harmful. The growth of the beauty industry meant that there were now powerful commercial interests invested in maintaining beauty standards that required constant product consumption. Professor Jones's research reveals that arsenic complexion wafers, lead-based cosmetics, various diet pills and appetite suppressants, corsets, and other beauty products were enormously profitable, and manufacturers had strong financial incentives to promote their use, despite knowing or suspecting that they were harmful. Advertising for beauty products used testimonials from satisfied customers, endorsements from doctors and celebrities, before and after claims, and appeals to women's insecurities and anxieties about appearance. The advertising created and intensified beauty anxieties, making women aware of flaws they hadn't noticed, suggesting that natural appearance was inadequate, promising that products could transform them into the ideal. According to Professor Jones, the beauty industry also created new problems that required new products to solve. Arsenic and lead cosmetics damaged skin, creating blemishes and discoloration that required more cosmetics to cover. Tight lacing caused digestive problems that were treated with patent medicines that often contained opium or alcohol. Extreme dieting caused weakness that was treated with various tonics and supplements. The industry profited not just from the original harmful products, but also from the cascade of problems those products created, creating a cycle where women needed more and more products to manage the damage caused by the products they were already using. Professor Jones's research includes analysis of the massive scale of the Victorian beauty industry. By the 1890s, hundreds of companies were manufacturing and selling beauty products. Beauty advice was a major category in magazine publishing. Beauty salons and services were available in most cities, and the industry employed thousands of people and generated millions of dollars in revenue. This commercial apparatus had vested interest in maintaining beauty standards that required constant product consumption, and it actively resisted reform efforts that would have reduced demand for harmful products. Think about what it means that there were powerful economic interests invested in maintaining harmful beauty standards. When reform movements tried to warn women about arsenic or promote healthier beauty practices, they were opposed not just by cultural inertia, but by an industry that profited from harmful practices. The beauty industry used its advertising budgets to shape media coverage, its political influence to resist regulation, its economic power to maintain systems that benefited from women's insecurity and compliance. The commercial interests made it even harder to challenge beauty standards because doing so threatened profits and livelihoods. Now let me tell you about variations in beauty standards across different Victorian cultures and how the pale, sick aesthetic was particularly intense in English-speaking countries, but existed in modified forms elsewhere. According to research by Professor Anne Hollander from Yale University, whose work examines the history of fashion and appearance, while the general Victorian beauty ideal of paleness and delicacy was widespread across Europe and America, there were regional and national variations in how intensely this standard was pursued, and which specific practices were most popular. Understanding these variations reveals that beauty standards are culturally constructed and variable, not natural or universal, even within a single historical period. Professor Hollander's research reveals that English and American women were particularly intense in their pursuit of consumptive pallor and extreme thinness, while French women, though they also valued pale skin, were more likely to use makeup to create the appearance rather than relying on illness and starvation. French beauty culture allowed more visible use of cosmetics than English culture, which meant French women could achieve fashionable pallor with powder and paint rather than having to actually make themselves pale through poisoning and blood loss. This cultural difference probably saved French women from some of the worst health consequences that English and American women suffered. According to Professor Hollander, German and Austrian beauty standards also valued pale skin, but placed more emphasis on robustness and health than English standards did, partly because of different cultural associations. In German culture, the pale maiden was balanced by ideals of healthy motherhood that required physical strength. Italian beauty standards retained more appreciation for curves and voluptuousness, even during the Victorian era, though pale skin was still valued over tan skin as a class marker. The global spread of Victorian beauty standards through colonialism and cultural exchange meant that these ideals influenced beauty culture worldwide, but with modifications based on local traditions and values. Professor Hollander's research includes fascinating examples of how Victorian beauty standards interacted with local beauty traditions in colonized regions. In India, where pale skin had long been valued as a caste and class marker, Victorian beauty products and practices were adopted by upper-class women, but modified to fit local aesthetics and traditions. In Japan, the traditional white-face makeup of geishas superficially resembled Victorian pale skin ideals, but the meanings and methods were entirely different. Japanese white makeup was about transformation and performance, not about simulating illness or signaling fragility. Think about what these variations reveal, that even within the Victorian period, beauty standards weren't monolithic or fixed. Different cultures interpreted and implemented the pale beauty ideal differently, some in ways that were more harmful and others in ways that were less so. This suggests that the most extreme Victorian beauty practices weren't inevitable or natural, but were specific cultural developments that could have been different, and that understanding this variability can help us recognize that modern beauty standards are also culturally constructed and changeable, rather than natural or inevitable. Let me tell you about the experiences of working-class Victorian women and how their relationship to beauty standards differed from that of middle and upper-class women. According to research by Professor Ellen Ross from Ramapo College, whose work examines working-class women's lives in Victorian England, working-class women were aware of fashionable beauty standards, but generally couldn't afford to follow them and had practical reasons not to try. A factory worker or domestic servant couldn't afford arsenic wafers or expensive corsets, couldn't fast or diet restrictively because she needed physical strength for her work, and couldn't afford to cultivate the fragility and weakness that were fashionable because she had to work to survive. Professor Ross's research reveals that this created a paradoxical situation where working-class women's inability to afford fashionable beauty practices actually protected their health. Poor women who ate adequately when they could, who didn't wear extremely tight corsets because they needed mobility for their work, who developed tanned skin and muscular bodies from outdoor labor, were healthier than wealthy women who could afford to poison and starve themselves. But working-class women were also aware that their healthy appearance marked them as lower class, and this awareness created its own psychological burden. According to Professor Ross, some working-class women who were upwardly mobile or who worked in positions where appearance mattered, shop girls, waitresses, performers, did try to achieve fashionable beauty on limited budgets, sometimes with dangerous results. They might use cheap, adulterated versions of beauty products that were even more toxic than the expensive versions, or they might use home remedies and improvised methods that were based on misunderstandings of fashionable practices. Professor Ross's research includes cases of working-class women who died or were seriously injured from poisoning by cheap cosmetics, from complications of amateur-tight lacing, or from other beauty-related mishaps. Professor Ross's research also reveals that working-class women developed their own beauty standards and practices that were somewhat different from fashionable standards. They valued cleanliness and neatness within their means. They used less expensive methods of adornment like ribbons and simple jewelry. They sometimes rejected fashionable standards as evidence of upper-class wastefulness and frivolity. Working-class beauty culture was more pragmatic and less focused on achieving the consumptive aesthetic, partly because working-class women couldn't afford it, and partly because they had different values and priorities. Think about the class dynamics this reveals. The beauty standards that were killing upper-class women weren't directly imposed on working-class women, who had some protection from the worst practices through sheer inability to afford them. But this also meant that working-class women were marked as unfashionable and lower class by their healthy appearance, and women who tried to cross class boundaries through adopting upper-class beauty practices often harmed themselves in the process. The system harmed all women, but in different ways depending on their class position. Now, let me tell you about Victorian men's beauty practices and the stark contrast with women's experiences. According to research by Professor Christopher Oldstone, more from Wright State University, whose work examines the history of masculine appearance, Victorian men also faced appearance standards and engaged in grooming and beauty practices, but the male beauty ideal emphasized health, vigor, and strength rather than delicacy and illness. Men were encouraged to exercise, to develop muscular physiques, to cultivate ruddy complexions through outdoor activity, to look robust and capable. The gender difference in beauty standards couldn't be more stark. What made men attractive was exactly what made women unattractive. Professor Oldstone Moore's research reveals that Victorian men did use some grooming products and did face pressure to maintain fashionable appearance, but male beauty practices were generally far less harmful than female practices. Men used hair pomades, cologne, and sometimes beard dyes, but they didn't use poisonous cosmetics to alter their skin colour or toxic products to change their basic appearance. Men wore restrictive clothing like high collars and tight shoes, but they didn't wear corsets that crushed their organs or garments that prevented breathing and movement. Men faced pressure to maintain proper weight, but the ideal male weight was robust and solid, not emaciated and weak. According to Professor Oldstone Moore, the differences in male and female beauty standards reflect broader gender ideologies. Men were valued for their physical and mental capabilities, for their ability to work and compete and dominate, and the male beauty ideal reflected these values. Strong, healthy, vigorous men could work harder, fight better, compete more successfully. Women were valued primarily for their ornamental and reproductive functions, and the female beauty ideal of delicate, fragile, unhealthy beauty reflected the ideology that women were meant to be looked at, not to do things, that they were decorative objects whose health and capability were less important than their appearance. Professor Oldstone Moore's research includes the revealing detail that Victorian men sometimes explicitly stated preferences for sickly-looking women, describing healthy, robust women as unfeminine and unattractive. Male writers praised the delicate, ethereal, spiritual beauty of pale, thin, weak women and described healthy women as coarse, common, or masculine. This male gaze valuing sickness in women created powerful incentives for women to make themselves sick, because male approval and attraction were essential to women's economic and social success through marriage. Think about the gendered double standard here. Men were supposed to be healthy and strong. Women were supposed to be sick and weak. Men achieved beauty through becoming more capable. Women achieved beauty through becoming less capable. Men's beauty practices enhanced their function. Women's beauty practices impaired their function. This wasn't accidental or natural. It reflected and reinforced power imbalances, where men needed to be strong and capable to dominate, and women needed to be weak and dependent to be dominated. Let me tell you about the medical profession's slow recognition of the harms caused by fashionable beauty practices, and how medical reform eventually contributed to changing beauty standards. According to research by Professor Regina Morant Sanchez from the University of Michigan, by the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, some doctors began to publicly challenge harmful beauty practices, publishing medical studies documenting the health consequences of tight lacing, arsenic use, extreme dieting, and other practices. These reform-minded doctors faced opposition from colleagues who profited from beauty products and treatments, from the beauty industry, and from patients who didn't want to hear that their beauty practices were harmful. Professor Morant Sanchez's research reveals that medical reform efforts intensified in the 1890s and early 1900s, with doctors publishing in medical journals about the specific injuries and illnesses they were seeing in patients who followed fashionable beauty practices. They documented cases of organ displacement and skeletal deformation from tight lacing, arsenic, and lead poisoning from cosmetics, malnutrition disorders from extreme dieting, and various other conditions directly caused by beauty practices. Some doctors began to refuse to prescribe or sell beauty products they considered dangerous, and some spoke out publicly against harmful beauty standards. According to Professor Morant Sanchez, medical reform was aided by the women's health movement and by early feminists who argued that beauty standards were tools of oppression and that women's health should take priority over appearance. These reform movements had some success. By the early 20th century, some of the worst beauty products were being removed from the market through consumer protection laws. Tight lacing was declining in popularity, and beauty advice was beginning to incorporate health concerns rather than treating health as completely subordinate to appearance. Professor Morant Sanchez's research also reveals that medical reform was limited and incomplete. While the worst excesses of Victorian beauty culture declined, many harmful practices persisted in modified forms, and new harmful practices emerged to replace old ones. Women in the early 20th century stopped using arsenic for pale skin, but took up skin bleaching with other toxic chemicals. They stopped extreme tight lacing, but adopted other restrictive undergarments. They stopped romanticizing consumption, but started romanticizing different forms of illness and frailty. The specific practices changed, but the underlying pattern, women harming themselves for beauty, proved remarkably persistent. Think about what limited medical reform reveals about how deep beauty culture goes. Even when doctors documented clear evidence of harm, even when medical authorities condemned specific practices, even when laws were passed against certain products, women continued to find ways to pursue harmful beauty standards because the social, economic, and cultural pressures to be beautiful remained intense. Changing specific products or practices wasn't enough without changing the underlying system that made beauty essential to women's value and success. Let me tell you about specific Victorian women whose pursuit of beauty killed them or destroyed their health, because understanding individual stories makes the horror of these practices more concrete and personal. According to research by Professor Sally Mitchell from Temple University, whose work examines Victorian women's lives through personal documents, Diaries, letters, and medical records from the Victorian era contain heartbreaking accounts of women who suffered severe health consequences from beauty practices, and some of these women documented their own decline in writing, creating first-hand testimony about what it felt like to slowly poison yourself or crush your organs in pursuit of an impossible beauty ideal. Professor Mitchell's research includes the case of Emily Barton, a middle-class London woman whose diary from 1852 to 1868 provides detailed documentation of her beauty practices and their consequences. Emily began using arsenic complexion wafers at age 17 when she was preparing for her social debut. Her early diary entries describe her excitement about the products. She wrote that within weeks of starting the wafers, her skin had become noticeably paler and more translucent, and she received compliments on her refined appearance. She carefully recorded her dosage, initially taking 1 wafer per Dalton Y as recommended, then increasing to 2, then 3 as she wanted faster and more dramatic results. According to Professor Mitchell, Emily's diary entries over the following years document her gradual poisoning in her own words, though she didn't recognize what was happening. By 1855, she was recording frequent headaches, digestive problems, and hair loss, but she attributed these to nerves and stress. By 1858, she was experiencing severe muscle weakness and periodic numbness in her hands and feet, which her doctor diagnosed as hysteria and treated with rest and laudanum, rather than recognizing as arsenic poisoning. By 1862, her entries describe constant pain, inability to keep food down, and episodes of confusion and memory loss. Professor Mitchell's analysis reveals that Emily continued using arsenic wafers throughout her illness, never connecting her beauty regimen with her declining health. Her final diary entries from early 1868 are barely legible. Her handwriting had deteriorated dramatically, suggesting severe neurological damage. She died in March 1868 at age 33, and her death certificate listed the cause as consumption, though her symptoms were consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning. Her family found dozens of empty arsenic wafer tins among her possessions after her death, but they apparently didn't understand the significance and didn't realize that Emily had poisoned herself in pursuit of pale beauty. Think about what Emily's diary reveals. She documented her own poisoning over 16 years, recording the symptoms that were killing her while continuing the practices that caused them. She died young, never married despite her beauty efforts, and spent more than a decade suffering from preventable poisoning that she inflicted on herself because society had convinced her that pale skin was essential to feminine beauty. Her story isn't unique. Professor Mitchell's research includes dozens of similar cases of women whose personal documents reveal the tragic consequences of Victorian beauty culture. Now let me tell you about the impact of Victorian beauty standards on children and adolescent girls, because understanding how young these practices began reveals the systematic nature of the harm. According to research by Professor Christina Hardiment from Oxford University, whose work examines Victorian childhood, girls were introduced to beauty culture at very young ages, often beginning restrictive dress and beauty practices in childhood or early adolescence that would affect their development and health for the rest of their lives. Parents, particularly mothers who had internalized beauty standards themselves, often initiated their daughters into harmful beauty practices, believing they were preparing them for successful adulthood. Professor Hardiman's research reveals that tight lacing often began in early adolescence, or even pre-adolescence, with girls as young as 10 or 12 being gradually accustomed to increasingly restrictive corsets. The practice of training the waist began before the body had finished developing, which meant that girls' bones, organs, and muscles developed under constant compression and restriction. Medical records from the period document cases of severe skeletal deformation, stunted growth, and organ problems in girls who had been tight-laced from an early age, and doctors noted that women who had begun tight-lacing in childhood showed more severe physical damage than those who had begun the practice in adulthood. According to Professor Hardiment, mothers who tight-laced their daughters genuinely believed they were helping them, They saw waist training as necessary preparation for adult life, as essential to their daughters' marriage prospects and social success as teaching them to read or sew. Beauty manuals and women's magazines reinforced this view, advising mothers to begin beauty training early and praising mothers who successfully shaped their daughters into the fashionable ideal. The mother-daughter transmission of harmful beauty practices created a cycle where women who had suffered themselves inflicted the same suffering on the next generation, not out of cruelty, but out of love and desire to prepare their daughters for a world that valued beauty above health. Professor Hardiman's research includes the case of the Weston family, whose account books and correspondence from the 1870s document the process of preparing 3 daughters for society debuts. The mother, Martha Weston, herself a tight lasser who suffered from chronic digestive problems, began corseting her daughters at ages 11, 12, and 13. Letters between Martha and her sister describe the process, initially using lightly boned stays for a few hours, per Dalton Y., gradually increasing the restriction and duration over months and years, dealing with the girls' complaints of pain and difficulty breathing, celebrating when their waists measured progressively smaller. By the time the eldest daughter, Caroline, made her debut at 18, her waist measured 17 inches, achieved through 7 years of progressive waist training that had permanently deformed her rib cage and displaced her organs. Think about what it means that this harm began in childhood, inflicted by loving parents who believed they were helping their daughters succeed. Children who were still growing and developing were subjected to physical restriction and poisoning because beauty culture had convinced adults that preparing girls for beauty was more important than protecting their health and development. And the girls themselves internalized these standards at young ages, learning before they were old enough to consent or understand the consequences, that their value depended on their appearance, and that achieving beauty required suffering. According to Professor Hardiman, girls' diaries and letters from the Victorian era reveal the psychological impact of being raised in this beauty culture. Many girls expressed anxiety about their appearance from very young ages, worried that they weren't pretty enough, compared themselves unfavourably to more beautiful peers, and accepted that achieving beauty would require pain and restriction. Some girls resisted, refusing to wear tight corsets, complaining about beauty regimens, expressing resentment about the double standard that allowed their brothers freedom while they were restricted. But resistance was difficult when everyone around them, including the women they loved and trusted, insisted that beauty practices were necessary and normal. Let me tell you about the role of Victorian literature and arts in romanticising and perpetuating harmful beauty standards, because cultural representations had enormous power in shaping what people believed about beauty and illness. According to research by Professor Elizabeth Helsinger from the University of Chicago, whose work examines Victorian visual and literary culture, the most celebrated beauties in Victorian literature and art were consistently portrayed as pale, thin, ethereal, and often dying or dead. The ideal woman in Victorian cultural production was someone like Ophelia drowning beautifully, like Tennyson's Lady of Shalott dying in her boat, like the countless consumptive heroines of Victorian novels, who grew more beautiful as they grew sicker. Professor Helsinger's research reveals that pre-Raphaelite painters like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and Edward Burne Jones created canonical images of Victorian beauty that featured women with extremely pale skin, long necks, thin bodies, and expressions of languid weakness or tragic suffering. These paintings were immensely popular and influential. They hung in galleries, were reproduced in prints that decorated middle-class homes, were discussed in magazines and newspapers. The women who modelled for these paintings, including Elizabeth Siddal, Jane Morris, and others, became famous as beauty ideals, and their appearances were analysed and discussed as exemplars of perfect feminine beauty. According to Professor Helsinger, the problem was that these artistic representations of beauty were explicitly connected to illness, death, and suffering. Millais's famous painting Ophelia shows Elizabeth Siddal as the drowning Shakespearean heroine, floating in water surrounded by flowers, her face pale and ethereal in death. To achieve the painting, Siddle posed in a bathtub for hours while Millet painted, and she became seriously ill from the cold water. But the resulting image became one of the most iconic representations of Victorian beauty, and countless women tried to emulate the pale, tragic aesthetic it portrayed. Professor Helsinger's research reveals that Elizabeth Siddle herself exemplified the tragic intersection of beauty standards and health. She was celebrated for her ethereal beauty, her pale skin, red gold hair, thin frame, and melancholy expression made her the perfect pre-Raphaelite muse. But Siddle struggled with ill health throughout her short life, suffered from what was probably an eating disorder, became addicted to laudanum, and died at 32 from a laudanum overdose that may have been suicide. She was beautiful in exactly the way Victorian culture valued: pale, thin, fragile, tragic, and she died young, becoming in death even more of a romantic icon than she had been in life. Think about the cultural power of these representations, when the most celebrated paintings, the most popular novels, the most praised poetry all portrayed beauty as inseparable from illness and death, when the most famous beauties were dying women, when happiness and health were portrayed as coarse and unrefined while suffering was spiritual and beautiful. This created a cultural environment where women genuinely believed that looking sick was desirable. Art didn't just reflect beauty standards, it created and intensified them, giving them emotional resonance and cultural authority that made them even more powerful and harder to resist. According to Professor Helsinger, Victorian literature reinforced these visual representations with countless stories of beautiful, dying women. Charles Dickens's Little Nell, dying beautifully and virtuously in the old curiosity shop, became such a cultural phenomenon that crowds supposedly gathered at docks waiting for ships, bringing the magazine installments to learn if she had died yet. Charlotte Brondt's Helen Burns in Jane Eyre, dying of consumption with saintly patience. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry celebrating feminine weakness and suffering. Countless Victorian novels where the most virtuous and beautiful heroines died young, their deaths portrayed as tragic, but somehow fitting, as if their beauty and goodness made them too pure for earthly existence. Professor Helsinger's research includes analysis of how these literary representations affected real women. Women's diaries and letters reference literary and artistic beauties as models to emulate, describe trying to achieve the pale, ethereal look of pre-Raphaelite paintings or tragic novel heroines, express admiration for fictional characters who suffered beautifully. The cultural representation of beauty as inseparable from suffering gave women a narrative framework for understanding their own beauty practices. They weren't just poisoning themselves or crushing their organs, they were becoming like the celebrated beauties of art and literature, achieving a refined, spiritual, tragically beautiful aesthetic that elevated them above ordinary, coarse, healthy women. Now let me tell you about the specific advertising techniques used to sell harmful beauty products, and how Victorian advertising created and manipulated women's insecurities. According to research by Professor Julianne Sivolka from Loyola University Chicago, whose work examines advertising history, Victorian beauty product advertising pioneered many of the manipulative techniques still used today, creating problems that didn't exist, promising transformations that weren't possible, using fake testimonials and fraudulent before and after claims, and exploiting women's legitimate anxieties about their limited life options. The advertising was so effective because it correctly identified that women's economic and social futures depended on their appearance, and it promised solutions to a real problem, even though the solutions themselves were dangerous or fraudulent. Professor Sivolka's research reveals that arsenic complexion wafer advertisements typically followed a formula. They began by suggesting that the reader might have skin problems she hadn't noticed or worried about sufficiently: freckles, blemishes, uneven colour, lack of refinement. They described these problems in language that made them sound serious and socially disastrous, suggesting that even minor skin imperfections would prevent marriage. cause social embarrassment, and mark the woman as lower class. Then they presented their product as the solution, often using fake medical authority where commended by physicians. Scientifically formulated, used by the most refined ladies of society. According to Professor Savolka, advertisements included fake testimonials from women who claimed miraculous results. Skin transformed from coarse to refined, freckles vanished, complexions made translucent and pale. Marriage proposals received after beginning the wafers. These testimonials were detailed and specific enough to seem credible, often including the woman's name and location, though many were entirely fabricated. Some advertisements included before and after illustrations showing dramatic transformations, though these were artistic inventions rather than real documentation. The overall effect was to create the impression that the product worked miraculously and that any woman who wanted beauty needed to purchase it. Professor Savolka's research includes specific examples of misleading advertising. Dr. Mackenzie's improved harmless arsenic complexion wafers, one of the most popular brands, advertised extensively in women's magazines in the 1880s. The advertisements claimed the product was perfectly safe, harmless when used as directed, and recommended by eminent physicians. They included testimonials from women claiming to have used the wafers for years without ill effects and with beautiful results. In reality, the wafers contained dangerous amounts of arsenic. There was no safe dosage for long-term use, and many women were seriously poisoned or killed by the product. The eminent physicians who supposedly recommended them were either fictional or had been paid to endorse the product without actually examining it or testing it. Think about how this advertising worked. It identified a real problem. Women's life prospects really did depend on their appearance, and promised a solution while minimizing or lying about the risks. It used medical and scientific language to seem credible, testimonials to seem trustworthy, and before and after claims to seem effective. Women who bought these products weren't being foolish or ignorant, they were responding to sophisticated manipulation that exploited their legitimate concerns. And when the products caused harm, the advertising had already provided explanations. The woman must have used it wrong, must have exceeded the recommended dose, must have had some pre-existing condition. The harm was individualized and blamed on the user rather than on the product itself. According to Professor Savolka, beauty product advertising also created artificial urgency and scarcity to pressure women into purchasing. Advertisements claimed that supplies were limited, that prices would increase soon, that the formula might be banned by jealous competitors or restrictive governments. They suggested that women who delayed purchasing would miss their chance at beauty and all the opportunities beauty provided: marriage, social success, happiness. This created panic buying and impulsive decisions, with women purchasing dangerous products without fully considering the risks because they felt time pressure to act immediately. Let me tell you about the psychological and mental health impacts of Victorian beauty culture, because the harm wasn't only physical but also deeply psychological. According to research by Professor Joan Jacobs Bromberg from Cornell University, whose work examines the history of body image and eating disorders, Victorian beauty standards created what we would now recognize as widespread body dysmorphia, eating disorders, anxiety disorders, and depression among women who couldn't achieve or maintain the beauty ideal. The constant pressure to monitor and modify their appearance, the anxiety about being judged and found wanting, the shame about natural bodies and healthy appetites. All of this took enormous psychological toll that Victorian medicine didn't recognize or address. Professor Bromberg's research reveals that Victorian women's diaries and letters contain extensive evidence of body image distress, obsessive preoccupation with appearance, and disordered eating that matches modern diagnostic criteria for conditions like anorexia nervosa and body dysmorphic disorder. Women wrote about constantly examining themselves in mirrors, seeing flaws that others didn't notice, feeling intense anxiety about social situations where their appearance would be judged, engaging in increasingly extreme behaviors to control their appearance. This wasn't vanity or superficiality. It was psychological distress caused by living in a culture that made women's value entirely dependent on meeting impossible beauty standards. According to Professor Bromberg, eating disorders were common among Victorian women, though they weren't recognized as medical or psychological conditions. The vinegar diet, extreme fasting, deliberate appetite suppression, obsessive focus on thinness, secret eating, and purging behaviors. All of these were documented in Victorian sources, but were understood as beauty practices rather than as symptoms of mental illness. Women who starved themselves to achieve fashionable thinness were praised for their self-control and dedication to beauty, rather than recognized as suffering from eating disorders that required treatment. Professor Bromberg's research includes the case of Sarah Jacob, the Welsh fasting girl, whose story in the 1860s captured public attention and revealed Victorian attitudes toward female appetite and eating. Sarah, a girl of about 10, claimed to have stopped eating entirely and to be surviving without food, supposedly living on air and divine sustenance. Her parents exhibited her as a curiosity, and people came from across Britain to see the miraculous fasting girl. Medical authorities eventually investigated, placing Sarah under hospital observation to determine if she was genuinely not eating. During the observation period, Sarah refused all food, and after several weeks, she died of starvation while doctors and her parents watched, each side committed to their position about whether she needed to eat. Think about what Sarah Jacobs' death reveals about Victorian culture. A child starved herself to death while adults watched and documented the process. And even after her death, there was debate about whether she had been genuinely fasting or simply exhibiting extreme willpower. Female appetite and eating were so moralized, so connected to issues of virtue and self-control, that a girl's refusal to eat could be seen as spiritual and admirable, rather than as mental illness requiring intervention. And while Sarah Jacobs' case was extreme, the underlying attitudes, that female appetite was problematic, that not eating demonstrated virtue and refinement, that thinness was more important than health, were mainstream Victorian beliefs that affected countless women. According to Professor Bromberg, Victorian women also suffered from anxiety and depression related to appearance pressures, though these psychological problems were usually diagnosed as hysteria or nerves, rather than being understood as mental health conditions caused by social pressures. Women who were anxious about their appearance, who felt inadequate or worthless because they couldn't achieve beauty standards, who experienced depression related to their perceived unattractiveness. These women were treated with rest cures, tonics, or dismissal, rather than with recognition that their distress was a rational response to an oppressive system. Professor Bromberg's research reveals that the psychological harm of beauty culture was often more persistent and damaging than the physical harm. Physical damage could sometimes heal if women stopped harmful practices, but psychological damage, the internalized belief that one's value depended on appearance, the obsessive focus on body monitoring and modification, the anxiety and shame about natural bodies, could last a lifetime and could be transmitted to the next generation as women taught their daughters the same destructive attitudes they had learned. Now, let me tell you about how Victorian beauty standards spread globally through British colonialism and cultural influence, and how these standards affected women in colonized regions. According to research by Professor Antoinette Burton from the University of Illinois, whose work examines gender and empire, British beauty standards were exported along with British political and economic power, and women in colonized regions faced pressure to adopt British beauty ideals even when these ideals were incompatible with their natural appearance, climate, or cultural traditions. The spread of Victorian beauty culture was part of the broader cultural imperialism that accompanied political colonialism. Professor Burton's research reveals that in British India, Victorian beauty standards emphasizing pale skin reinforced and intensified existing Indian preferences for lighter skin while adding British-specific elements like thinness and fragility. British beauty products, including some of the most dangerous ones like arsenic and lead cosmetics, were marketed to Indian women with promises that they could achieve British standards of refinement and elegance. Indian women who adopted British beauty practices faced double standards. They were encouraged to emulate British beauty, but were simultaneously told they could never truly achieve British refinement, creating impossible pressures and psychological harm. According to Professor Burton, missionary schools and colonial education systems taught colonised women that British beauty standards represented civilization and modernity, while indigenous beauty practices were primitive and backward. Girls in colonial schools were taught to wear British-style restrictive clothing, to avoid sun exposure to maintain pale skin, to value thinness over the more robust builds that were traditional in many cultures. This cultural indoctrination affected multiple generations and had lasting impacts on beauty culture in formerly colonized regions, where preferences for pale skin and thin bodies persisted long after colonial rule ended. Professor Burton's research includes examples of how colonial beauty standards caused specific harms. In hot climates, British-style restrictive clothing and corsetry were even more uncomfortable and dangerous than in Britain, causing heat exhaustion and heat stroke, in addition to the usual problems of restriction and organ compression. In regions where outdoor work was necessary for survival, the emphasis on pale skin as a beauty ideal created impossible conflicts between economic necessity and beauty standards. And in cultures where fuller figures had traditionally been valued as signs of health and prosperity, the British emphasis on extreme thinness introduced eating disorders and body image problems that hadn't previously existed. Think about the colonial dimension of beauty standards. British power meant that British beauty ideals were imposed on women worldwide, regardless of whether these ideals made sense in local contexts. Women in colonized regions were told their natural appearance was inferior, that they needed to transform themselves to meet British standards, and that failure to achieve British beauty marked them as uncivilized. This was cultural violence that accompanied political and economic violence, and its effects persisted long after formal colonial rule ended. Many of the beauty preferences in formerly colonized regions today, preferences for pale skin, for thin bodies, for features that approximate British beauty ideals, are legacies of colonial imposition of Victorian beauty standards. Let me tell you about the transition from Victorian to Edwardian beauty standards, and how the changes were both continuity and disruption. According to research by Professor Cheryl Buckley from the University of Brighton, whose work examines design and fashion history, the Edwardian period beginning around 1901 saw some modifications to Victorian beauty ideals, but also persistence of the fundamental pattern of women harming themselves for beauty. The Edwardian Gibson girl ideal celebrated a slightly more robust and athletic figure than the Victorian consumptive aesthetic. But Edwardian women still tight, laced to achieve extreme wasp waists, still used dangerous cosmetics, still engaged in practices that damaged their health. Professor Buckley's research reveals that Edwardian beauty culture added new harmful practices while maintaining many Victorian ones. The Edwardian emphasis on large breasts and hips combined with tiny waists meant that women who were naturally thin used padding to create curves, while women who were naturally curvy tight laced even more extremely to create the required waist to hip ratio. The invention of new beauty technologies like X-ray hair removal created new ways for women to harm themselves in pursuit of beauty. X-ray treatments for unwanted hair caused radiation burns, scarring and increased cancer risk, but were marketed as modern scientific beauty solutions. According to Professor Buckley, Edwardian advertising and beauty culture were even more sophisticated and manipulative than Victorian predecessors, using psychology and emerging consumer culture techniques to create demand. The Edwardian period saw the beginning of modern beauty magazines like Vogue, the expansion of departments, stores with elaborate beauty departments, the emergence of celebrity beauty culture where women tried to emulate actresses and socialites, All of these developments intensified the pressure to achieve beauty and made beauty culture more commercial and more closely tied to consumer capitalism. Professor Buckley's research also reveals that Edwardian feminists and reformers continued and intensified Victorian critiques of harmful beauty practices, with growing movements for dress reform, rational clothing, and rejection of beauty culture. The suffragette movement in particular challenged connections between femininity, beauty, and weakness, with suffragettes deliberately adopting practical clothing and rejecting the delicate, fragile aesthetic in favour of strength and capability. But these reform movements faced even more intense backlash in the Edwardian period, with anti-suffragette propaganda explicitly connecting women's political activism with unattractiveness, suggesting that women who wanted rights must be ugly and bitter. Think about what the Victorian to Edwardian transition reveals. That changing specific beauty standards didn't end the pattern of women harming themselves for beauty. The particular ideal shifted from the consumptive to the Gibson girl, but women still used corseting, poisonous cosmetics, extreme dieting, and other harmful practices. New technologies created new ways to damage health in pursuit of beauty, and resistance to harmful beauty standards continued to be punished and marginalized. The specific practices and ideals changed, but the fundamental system women's value depending on appearance, beauty requiring suffering, resistance being punished, persisted across the transition. Now, let me tell you about the marriage market and how Victorian beauty standards functioned as economic calculation in a system where marriage was often women's only path to financial security. According to research by Professor Leonore Davidoff from the University of Essex, whose work examines Victorian family and gender economics, the Victorian marriage market was literally a market where women's beauty was their primary asset, and where families invested in daughters' appearance as a financial strategy aimed at securing advantageous marriages. The enormous effort and expense devoted to beauty, the arsenic and corsets and vinegar and belladonna, made economic sense within a system where a beautiful daughter could marry into wealth, while an unattractive daughter faced limited options and potential poverty. Professor Davidoff's research reveals that Victorian families explicitly calculated the return on investment of beauty expenditures. A middle-class family might spend significant portions of their income on a daughter's appearance during her marriageable years, roughly ages 17 to 25, because a successful marriage to a wealthy man would provide financial security for the daughter and potentially for her birth family as well. Beauty products, fashionable clothing, presentation at balls and social events, even cosmetic medical treatments. All of these were understood as investments that would ideally pay off in the form of a wealthy husband. According to Professor Davidoff, this economic calculation helps explain why families supported and encouraged their daughters' use of harmful beauty practices, even when they knew or suspected these practices were dangerous. The risks of arsenic poisoning or organ damage from tight lacing were weighed against the certainty of poverty or limited opportunities if the daughter didn't marry well. When the alternative to beauty was economic insecurity, lifetime dependence on relatives, work in poorly paid occupations considered degrading for middle-class women, or remaining an unmarried burden on one's family, the risk of dying from beauty practices could seem like an acceptable gamble. Professor Davidoff's research includes specific examples of family correspondence discussing daughters' marriage prospects in explicitly economic terms, calculating the costs of beauty preparations against the expected value of potential matches. One father's letters from the 1860s describe spending nearly £200 per year, more than many working-class families earned total on his daughter's clothing, beauty products, and social season expenses, an amount he considered justified because she successfully attracted a suitor with £600 per year income. The return on investment was calculated as very favourable, even though the daughter's health had been damaged by the extreme tight lacing and arsenic use that achieved her marriageable beauty. Think about what this reveals about Victorian economic structures. Women were excluded from most well-paid occupations, couldn't control property in most cases if they married, had few legal rights, and limited economic independence. In this system, beauty became women's primary economic asset, the thing they could invest in and trade for security through marriage. The harm women inflicted on themselves for beauty wasn't irrational or vain. It was rational economic calculation within a system that made beauty essential to survival. Women poisoned and crushed themselves because not doing so meant accepting poverty, dependence, and social failure. According to Professor Davidoff, the marriage market also created intense competition among women, which further intensified pressure to pursue extreme beauty measures. When there were more marriageable women than wealthy potential husbands, when families were competing to secure advantageous matches for their daughters, women who weren't willing to risk their health for beauty were at competitive disadvantage. If other women were using arsenic and extreme tight lacing, you had to use them too just to remain competitive, creating a race to the bottom where the beauty standards became progressively more extreme and harmful as women competed to outdo each other. Let me tell you about widowhood and how older Victorian women experienced beauty culture, because understanding the life course of beauty pressure reveals that it didn't end with marriage. According to research by Professor Pat Jalland from the Australian National University, whose work examines Victorian death and mourning, widows faced complex and contradictory beauty expectations. They were supposed to demonstrate grief through specific appearances, while also potentially needing to remarry for economic reasons, creating tensions between mourning conventions and beauty culture. And older women more generally faced the reality that beauty standards were youth-focused, meaning that aging inevitably meant failing to meet the ideal. Professor Jalland's research reveals that Victorian widows, particularly young widows, faced an impossible bind. Mourning conventions required specific dress, black clothing, veils, minimal adornment for extended periods, sometimes years. These mourning clothes were explicitly designed to make women less attractive, to signal that they were withdrawn from social and romantic circulation. But many widows, particularly those left without adequate financial support, needed to remarry for economic survival, which meant eventually returning to beauty culture and the marriage market. The tension between proper mourning and economic necessity created significant stress and social judgment. According to Professor Jalland, older widows and never-married older women faced different pressures. They were generally released from the expectation of pursuing beauty because they were considered past marriageable age. But this release came at the cost of social irrelevance and invisibility. Victorian culture had little interest in older women's appearance because older women weren't operating in the marriage or social display markets. This meant older women were freed from some beauty pressures, but also meant they were dismissed and marginalized, their value and visibility disappearing along with their beauty. Professor Jalland's research includes examples of older women's writings about their relationships with beauty culture. Some expressed relief at no longer feeling pressure to maintain beauty, no more tight lacing, no more arsenic, no more constant monitoring and modification of appearance. But others expressed grief and loss about becoming invisible, about no longer receiving the social attention and validation that beauty had brought, about feeling worthless once beauty faded. The fact that women could feel both relief and loss reveals how deeply beauty culture affected women's sense of self-worth and social value. Think about what this reveals about the life course of Victorian beauty pressure. It wasn't a temporary phase that women passed through. It was central to their identity and social value during their most economically vulnerable years, and its loss in older age meant losing social relevance and visibility. Women spent their youth harming themselves for beauty, achieved whatever success or failure that beauty brought, and then spent their older years dealing with the long-term health consequences of their earlier beauty practices, while simultaneously becoming socially invisible. The system extracted value from women's bodies and appearances during youth, and then discarded them once that value faded. Now let me tell you about servants and working class women's roles in maintaining upper class beauty, because the labour behind Victorian beauty was largely invisible, according to research by Professor Lucy Delap from the University of Cambridge, whose work examines domestic service and labour history. Maintaining the elaborate beauty regimens of wealthy Victorian women required enormous labour, from maids who helped with dressing and undressing tight corsets, to servants who prepared beauty treatments and cosmetics, to the whole infrastructure of workers who produced and sold beauty products. The class dimensions of beauty went beyond who could afford which practices to include, whose labour made those practices possible. Professor Delap's research reveals that ladies' maids had intimate knowledge of their employers' beauty practices, including the harmful ones, and were often complicit in implementing them even when they caused obvious damage. Maids tightened corset laces until their mistresses couldn't breathe, prepared arsenic and lead cosmetics, applied belladonna eye drops, helped mistresses maintain beauty regimens that the maids could see were causing illness. Some servants expressed concern in their personal writings about employers' beauty practices, but they couldn't refuse to assist without risking their employment. According to Professor Delap, servants also observed the gap between Victorian beauty ideals and the reality of women's bodies. They saw the bruising and deformation caused by tight lacing, smelled the vinegar on employers' breath from appetite suppression diets, witnessed the illness from arsenic and lead poisoning, helped clean up when beauty practices caused vomiting or fainting. Servants' memoirs and letters reveal that many were aware their employers were harming themselves, but felt unable to speak out because class hierarchies meant that servants' knowledge and concerns were dismissed or ignored. Professor Delap's research includes specific examples of servants' accounts of employers' beauty practices. One lady's maid's memoir from the 1890s describes her horror at being required to lace her employer's corset progressively tighter over a 2-year period, watching the woman's waist shrink from 22 inches to 17 inches, while her health deteriorated dramatically. The maid wrote that she tried to express concern, but was dismissed as impertinent. Her employer insisted that achieving the desired waist measurement was worth any temporary discomfort. The maid noted that the temporary discomfort included constant vomiting, inability to eat solid food, fainting multiple times daily, and eventually a complete physical collapse that required months of recovery, during which the corset had to be loosened. Think about the labour and class dimensions this reveals. Wealthy women's beauty required working class women's labour to implement and maintain. Servants laced the corsets, prepared the poisons, witnessed the suffering, and were expected to remain silent about what they observed. The beauty practices that signalled upper-class status were literally made possible by lower-class labour, creating a system where women's oppression by beauty standards intersected with class exploitation and labour extraction. Let me tell you about religious perspectives on Victorian beauty and vanity, and how religion both opposed and enabled harmful beauty practices, according to research by Professor Callum Brown from the University of Dundee, whose work examines religion and gender in Victorian Britain. Christian teaching presented contradictory messages about female beauty, condemning vanity and excessive concern with appearance, while simultaneously teaching that women should make themselves pleasing and should demonstrate virtue through specific forms of feminine appearance, including delicacy and modesty. This contradiction meant that religion sometimes opposed harmful beauty practices as vain, but often supported the gender ideologies that made beauty essential to feminine virtue. Professor Brown's research reveals that Victorian sermons and religious writings frequently condemned women's vanity and warned against excessive attention to appearance, citing biblical passages about inner beauty and the dangers of pride. Some religious leaders specifically condemned arsenic use, tight lacing, and other harmful practices as violations of the body as temple of God, as vain pursuits that distracted from spiritual development. Religious dress reform movements argued that Christian women should prioritize health and modesty over fashionable beauty, and some religious communities developed alternative dress codes that rejected harmful practices. According to Professor Brown, however, religious teaching also reinforced many of the ideologies underlying Victorian beauty culture. Christianity taught that women should be modest, pure, and physically delicate, that robust health and physical strength were unfeminine and inappropriate for Christian women. Religious writing praised feminine suffering and self-sacrifice, teaching that enduring pain with patience was Christian virtue. The association between female delicacy and spiritual refinement, the idea that earthly, physical, robust women were less spiritual than pale, otherworldly women, aligned perfectly with the beauty standards that romanticized illness and weakness. Professor Brown's research includes examples of how religious women navigated these contradictions. Some devout Victorian women rejected harmful beauty practices as sinful vanity, accepting social consequences and potential marriage difficulties as the price of religious integrity. Others reconciled beauty practices with religious teaching by arguing that making oneself attractive wasn't vanity, but rather fulfilling women's duty to be pleasing, or that the suffering involved in beauty practices was acceptable Christian self-mortification. Still, others experienced significant guilt and internal conflict, believing their beauty practices were sinful, but feeling unable to abandon them because of social and economic pressures. Think about how religion both challenged and reinforced beauty culture. Religious teaching could have provided powerful opposition to harmful beauty standards by prioritizing health and spiritual development over appearance, by condemning practices that damaged God's creation, by offering women identity and value beyond their looks. But religion was embedded in the same patriarchal system as beauty culture, teaching many of the same ideologies about femininity, weakness, suffering, and women's duty to please. Religion provided some women with resources to resist beauty culture, but it provided others with justifications for accepting it. According to Professor Brown, religious institutions also participated in the beauty industry and beauty culture in various ways. Church bazaars and charity sales sold beauty products to raise funds. Church publications ran advertisements for beauty products, including harmful ones. Religious schools taught girls beauty practices alongside religious instruction. Some religious leaders profited from beauty culture. Priests endorsed beauty products for payment. Religious communities manufactured and sold beauty products. Church institutions invested in beauty industry companies. Religion was implicated in the same commercial and ideological systems that promoted harmful beauty practices. Now let me tell you about the actual medical and autopsy findings from Victorian women who died from beauty practices, because understanding the physical evidence makes the harm undeniable. According to research by Professor Ruth Richardson from the University of Hertfordshire, whose work examines Victorian medicine and anatomy, medical journals and autopsy reports from the Victorian era documented numerous cases where beauty practices were identified as causes or contributing factors in women's deaths, and physical examination of skeletal remains from the period provides material evidence of the bodily damage caused by practices like tight lacing and malnutrition. Professor Richardson's research reveals that Victorian medical journals published numerous case reports of deaths attributed to corset-related injuries, perforated stomachs or intestines from corset stays, liver damage from constant compression, displaced organs leading to organ failure, respiratory failure from restricted breathing. Doctors documented finding grossly deformed rib cages during autopsies of women who had tight-laced, with lower ribs bent inward at impossible angles, sometimes overlapping, sometimes fractured and healed incorrectly. They found stomachs, livers and intestines crushed and displaced, pushed down into the pelvic cavity where they clearly couldn't function properly. According to Professor Richardson, autopsy reports also documented poisoning from beauty products. Women who died with symptoms consistent with chronic arsenic or lead poisoning were found upon examination to have massive accumulations of heavy metals in their organs, livers, kidneys, and bones containing levels of arsenic or lead that made poisoning diagnosis unmistakable. In some cases, doctors tested the women's beauty products after death and found dangerous concentrations of toxic substances, confirming that the products themselves were the poison source. These medical findings provided clear evidence of harm, yet the products continued to be sold and women continued to use them. Professor Richardson's research includes specific documented cases. In 1882, an inquest into the death of Agnes Thompson, aged 24, found that she had died of arsenic poisoning from complexion wafers she had used for 3 years. The autopsy revealed arsenic concentrations in her hair, nails, and organs at levels considered definitely lethal, and examination of the wafer product found it contained approximately 4 grains of arsenic per wafer, a dangerous dose that accumulated to toxic levels with regular use. Despite this clear evidence presented at public inquest, the wafer manufacturer faced no criminal charges and continued selling the product with only minor label changes. Think about what it means that the medical evidence was documented, published, and publicly known, yet the practices continued largely unchanged. Victorian doctors knew that arsenic was killing women, knew that tight lacing was deforming skeletons and crushing organs, knew that extreme dieting was causing malnutrition and death. They published this evidence, testified at inquests, wrote articles warning about the dangers. But the economic interests profiting from beauty culture, the social systems that made beauty essential to women's survival, and the cultural ideologies that normalized women's suffering were all more powerful than medical evidence and expert warnings. According to Professor Richardson, modern examination of Victorian skeletal remains provides additional physical evidence of beauty-related damage. Archaeological analysis of remains from Victorian cemeteries shows high rates of rib deformation consistent with tight lacing, evidence of nutritional deficiencies consistent with extreme dieting, and bone chemistry indicating heavy metal exposure consistent with use of arsenic and lead cosmetics. The bones literally preserve evidence of the harm, providing material proof that thousands of Victorian women damaged their bodies in pursuit of beauty. Let me tell you about international comparisons and how Victorian beauty practices compared to beauty standards in other cultures during the same period, because seeing the variations reveals that Victorian standards weren't natural or inevitable. According to research by Professor Maxine Berg from the University of Warwick, whose work examines global history of consumption, different cultures in the 19th century had dramatically different beauty standards and practices, some equally harmful but others significantly less so. Comparing Victorian practices to contemporary alternatives demonstrates that the specific harms of Victorian beauty culture were culturally constructed choices rather than universal constants. Professor Berg's research reveals that in China during the Qing dynasty, the practice of foot binding created a completely different but equally harmful beauty standard, where women's feet were deliberately broken and bound to create tiny lotus feet that were considered beautiful. Like Victorian tight lacing, foot binding began in childhood, caused permanent skeletal deformation, severely limited physical capabilities, and signaled upper-class status by demonstrating that the woman didn't need to work. The parallel is striking. Both cultures valued beauty standards that deliberately disabled women and signaled that they were ornamental rather than functional, though the specific body part targeted and the specific type of deformation differed. According to Professor Berg, in contrast, some 19th century cultures had beauty standards that were less harmful than Victorian ones. In parts of Africa and the Pacific, beauty standards often valued healthy, robust bodies and physical capability, and beauty practices like decorative scarification or body painting, while painful, generally didn't cause the systematic organ damage or poisoning of Victorian practices. In Ottoman Turkey, beauty standards valued fuller figures and used cosmetics that, while not always safe, were generally less toxic than Victorian arsenic and lead products. These variations demonstrate that the Victorian path wasn't inevitable. Cultures could and did develop different beauty standards with different health implications. Professor Berg's research also reveals how international trade and cultural exchange spread harmful beauty practices globally. Victorian beauty products were exported worldwide. European and American beauty standards were promoted through colonialism and cultural influence. And by the end of the 19th century, there was increasing globalization of beauty culture, with Victorian practices influencing standards in regions far from Britain. This export of beauty culture meant that Victorian beauty practices harmed not only British women but women worldwide who were encouraged or pressured to adopt British standards. Think about what international comparison reveals: that the specific beauty standards that killed Victorian women were choices, not natural or biological imperatives. Other cultures made different choices, valued different things, created different standards. Victorian beauty culture was contingent and changeable, not fixed or inevitable. Understanding this contingency is important, because it means that the beauty standards that harm women today are also choices, also changeable, also not natural or inevitable facts about femininity. Now, let me tell you about specific beauty disasters and scandals that temporarily shocked Victorian society, but ultimately changed little. According to research by Professor Alison Matthews-David from Ryerson University, whose work examines fashion and its dangers, Victorian newspapers periodically reported sensational cases of beauty-related deaths or injuries. Woman who died at balls from tight lacing. Girls poisoned by arsenic cosmetics. Horrific injuries from flammable clothing or beauty devices. And these cases created temporary public outcry and calls for reform. But the outrage typically faded quickly and harmful practices continued with minimal change. The pattern of scandal, outrage, and return to normality reveals how deeply entrenched beauty culture was. Professor Matthews-David's research reveals one of the most notorious Victorian beauty disasters: the frequency of women's deaths from their clothing catching fire. Victorian women's fashion involved enormous quantities of highly flammable fabrics, crinolines, petticoats, elaborate dresses made of materials that burned rapidly. Women died by the hundreds when their clothing ignited from getting too close to fireplaces, candles, or gas lamps, and in many cases, the tight corsets they wore prevented them from quickly removing burning clothing or even from bending to extinguish flames. These deaths were widely reported, created public concern, and led to some advocacy for less flammable fabrics and less restrictive clothing. But fashion remained essentially unchanged. According to Professor Matthews-David, particularly notorious was the 1863 case of Lady Charlotte Guest, who survived but was permanently scarred when her crinoline brushed against a fireplace and ignited. The case received massive press coverage, with detailed descriptions of her injuries and commentary about the dangers of fashionable dress. There were calls for dress reform, suggestions that women should wear less flammable materials, proposals for laws regulating fabric flammability. But within months the crisis passed, crinolines remained fashionable, and women continued to die in clothing fires at rates that would be considered unconscionable if they occurred today. Professor Matthews-David's research includes statistics showing that throughout the Victorian era, deaths from clothing fires remained consistently high. Hundreds of women per year in Britain alone died when their clothing caught fire, with many more suffering severe burns and permanent disfigurement. Medical journals published articles about the epidemic of clothing fire injuries. Reformers created safer clothing designs. Some individuals and organizations campaigned for change, but the fundamental system that prioritized fashionable appearance over safety remained intact, and women continued to wear dangerously flammable clothing because the alternative was being unfashionable. Think about what this reveals about the power of beauty culture. Women were literally burning to death in their clothing, dying in numbers that constituted a public health crisis. And yet fashion didn't fundamentally change because beauty and fashionability were more important than safety. Each individual death was treated as a tragedy, but the system that made the deaths possible was defended as natural and unchangeable. Women were expected to manage the risk individually, to be more careful around fire, to choose slightly less flammable fabrics if possible, rather than fashion standards changing to eliminate the danger. Let me tell you about the economic costs of Victorian beauty and how the pursuit of beauty contributed to family financial stress and even ruin. According to research by Professor Margot Finn from University College London, whose work examines Victorian economic and consumer history, the costs of maintaining fashionable beauty could be ruinous for middle-class families, who were already financially strained by the need to maintain appropriate social appearances. The beauty industry extracted enormous sums from women and families who often couldn't afford the expenditure but felt they had no choice, creating cycles of debt and financial stress that affected entire families. Professor Finn's research reveals that beauty products, fashionable clothing, and related expenses could consume 20 to 30% or more of a middle-class family's annual income during years when daughters were being presented in society and seeking marriages. For families with multiple daughters, the accumulated costs over several years could be financially devastating. Account books and letters from Victorian families document the stress and conflict these expenses created. Fathers complaining about costs, mothers arguing that the expenditure was necessary, daughters caught between guilt about the expense and terror about failing to achieve beauty and marriageability. According to Professor Finn, the beauty industry encouraged and exploited this financial stress through credit arrangements, payment plans, and advertising that emphasized the necessity of beauty spending despite the cost. Beauty product manufacturers and fashion houses allowed middle-class women to purchase on credit, knowing that social pressure would compel payment even when families struggled financially. Women's magazines ran advertisements suggesting that beauty expenses should take priority over other family needs, that a daughter's appearance was worth any financial sacrifice, that families who couldn't or wouldn't spend adequately on beauty were failing their daughters. Professor Finn's research includes specific examples of families driven into debt by beauty expenses. One middle-class family's account books from the 1870s show that spending on their two daughters' beauty products, clothing, and social season expenses over 5 years totaled more than £1,000, approximately twice the father's annual income, and was financed partly through borrowing that took the family another decade to repay. Both daughters did successfully marry, which the family considered justification for the expense, but the financial stress created lasting family tensions and required other family members to sacrifice their own needs and wants. Think about what this reveals about how beauty culture functioned as economic extraction. The beauty industry profited enormously from women's and families' anxiety and desperation, selling products and services at prices that many could barely afford but felt unable to refuse. The system created a form of economic coercion where not spending on beauty meant accepting social and economic consequences that could be worse than debt. Families were trapped between financial ruin from beauty spending and social ruin from failing to spend on beauty, and the industry profited from this impossible bind. According to Professor Finn, the economic burden of beauty also affected women's attitudes toward themselves and their families. Women's diaries and letters express guilt about the costs of their beauty regimens, anxiety about being financial burdens, pressure to achieve results that would justify the expenditure through successful marriages. Some women described feeling like they were investments that might not pay off, that their value was calculated in monetary terms based on the costs of their beauty preparation and the financial value of the marriages they achieved. This commodification of women was explicit and understood by everyone involved, creating psychological harm alongside the physical and financial costs. Now let me tell you about the voices of Victorian women themselves, what they wrote in diaries and letters about their experiences with beauty culture, because hearing their own words makes their agency and suffering more tangible. According to research by Professor Sally Mitchell from Temple University, whose work includes extensive analysis of Victorian women's personal writings, diaries and letters reveal that women had complex, often conflicted relationships with beauty standards. They simultaneously understood that beauty requirements were oppressive and felt unable to resist them. They complained about the pain and expense while continuing harmful practices. They expressed both pride in achieving beauty and resentment about what it cost them. Professor Mitchell's research reveals that many Victorian women's diaries contain entries documenting their beauty routines, alongside reflections on the costs and consequences. One woman's diary from the 1860s describes her daily beauty regimen in detail: the arsenic wafers she took, the vinegar she drank, the hours spent in tight corsets, and also records her thoughts about the process. She wrote about the pain of tight lacing, the nausea from vinegar, the headaches from arsenic, but also about her fear of being unmarriageable if she didn't maintain these practices. Her entries reveal someone who understood she was harming herself, but felt she had no acceptable alternative. According to Professor Mitchell, women's letters to friends and family members often discussed beauty practices and products, sharing advice, comparing results, and offering support and commiseration about the difficulties and pain involved. These letters reveal beauty culture as a shared experience that bonded women together, even as it harmed them individually. Women warned each other about products that had made them particularly ill, recommended doctors who would help with beauty-related health problems, and offered encouragement to friends struggling with beauty requirements. The correspondence reveals that women understood the shared nature of their experience and tried to help each other navigate an oppressive system. Professor Mitchell's research includes examples of women's writing that explicitly critiqued beauty standards while acknowledging inability or unwillingness to fully resist them. One woman's letter from 1875 describes beauty requirements as tyranny and torture, but concludes that she must continue following them because a woman who is not beautiful has no hope of happiness in this world. Another woman's diary entry from 1868 describes watching her sister die from what was likely arsenic poisoning while continuing to use arsenic herself, writing that she knew it was dangerous, but beauty is worth any risk, for without it, I am nothing. Think about what these women's voices reveal. They weren't ignorant victims who didn't understand what was happening to them. They were agents making choices within constrained options, often fully aware that their choices were harming them, but unable to identify acceptable alternatives. Their writings show intelligence, self-awareness, critical thinking about the systems oppressing them, and also show how powerful those systems were in limiting their ability to resist. They documented their own suffering, and sometimes their own understanding of that suffering, and they kept suffering anyway because the alternatives seemed worse. According to Professor Mitchell, some women's writings express anger and resentment about beauty standards and the limited options available to women. These writings, often in private diaries rather than in letters that others might read, reveal that many Victorian women understood that beauty culture was unjust and harmful but felt powerless to change it. One woman's diary from 1883 contains an entry where she writes about hating her corsets, hating the arsenic that makes her sick, hating the constant monitoring of her appearance, but concludes, "What choice do I have? I must be beautiful, or I must be nothing, and I am not brave enough to choose to be nothing." Let me tell you about the lasting legacies of Victorian beauty culture and how it shaped modern beauty standards and practices. According to research by Professor Susan Bordeaux from the University of Kentucky, whose work we encountered earlier, many Victorian patterns persist in modified forms today. The equation of thinness with beauty and status, the willingness to use potentially dangerous products and procedures for appearance enhancement, the normalization of women's pain and discomfort in pursuit of beauty, the framing of beauty practices as self-care and empowerment, rather than as responses to oppressive standards, understanding Victorian precedents, helps us recognize parallel patterns in contemporary beauty culture. Professor Bordeaux's research reveals that modern diet culture is a direct descendant of Victorian practices, like the vinegar diet and appetite suppression. The specific methods have changed. Women today use different diet pills, different restrictive eating patterns, different language to describe what they're doing. But the underlying dynamic is the same. Women restrict food intake, sometimes to dangerous degrees, in pursuit of thinness that is culturally valued and presented as health, even when it is actually illness. The Victorian pattern of calling starvation something else, cultivating delicacy, refined appetite, dietary management, continues in modern terms like clean eating, intermittent fasting, wellness. According to Professor Bordeaux, modern cosmetic procedures including injectable neurotoxins like Botox, cosmetic surgery, chemical peels, and laser treatments are functionally similar to Victorian arsenic and lead cosmetics or belladonna eye drops. They're potentially dangerous intervent. Ions that promise beauty enhancement, they're marketed using medical and scientific language. They're normalized as acceptable beauty practices despite known risks, and women use them despite understanding that there are dangers involved. The Victorian pattern of accepting risk for beauty continues, just with different specific products and procedures. Professor Bordeaux's research reveals that modern shapewear and body modification practices continue Victorian tight lacing patterns. While modern shapewear doesn't typically cause the extreme organ damage of Victorian corsets, it operates on the same logic using external compression to force the body into an unnatural shape, accepting discomfort and restricted movement as prices of achieving fashionable silhouette, using technology to make the body appear different from how it naturally exists. And modern cosmetic surgery that removes ribs or modifies bone structure to achieve smaller waists is directly parallel to Victorian tight lacing, using more permanent methods to achieve the same goals. Think about how Victorian beauty culture lives on in modern forms. We're not using arsenic and vinegar and extreme tight lacing anymore. Medical knowledge and consumer protection laws have eliminated some of the most obviously dangerous Victorian practices, but we're using Botox and diet pills and cosmetic surgery and restrictive shapewear and skin bleaching chemicals. And these practices operate according to the same patterns that made Victorian beauty culture so harmful. The specific technologies change, but the underlying system women's value depending on appearance, beauty requiring suffering and risk, commercial interests profiting from women's insecurity, remains remarkably persistent. According to Professor Bordeaux, modern beauty culture also continues Victorian patterns of framing women's beauty practices as free choice and personal empowerment, while ignoring the coercive context in which those choices are made. Just as Victorian women chose to use arsenic and tight lacing within a system that made beauty essential to their economic survival and social success, modern women choose diet pills and cosmetic surgery within systems that still value women primarily for appearance and still create enormous pressure to meet beauty standards. The language of choice and empowerment obscures the ways that beauty culture operates as a system of control and compliance that limits real freedom and autonomy. Professor Bordeaux's research suggests that breaking these persistent patterns requires not just changing specific beauty practices, but challenging the underlying systems that make beauty central to women's value. Victorian medical reforms that eliminated specific dangerous products ultimately accomplished little because they didn't change the fundamental equation that made beauty essential to women's survival and success. Modern efforts to promote body positivity or criticize specific beauty practices face similar limitations. They challenge symptoms without addressing root causes. Real change would require transforming economic systems that make women's appearance relevant to their economic opportunities, challenging gender ideologies that make beauty central to femininity, resisting commercial interests that profit from beauty culture. As we come to the end of this journey through Victorian beauty culture, You might reflect on what these stories reveal about beauty, femininity, and the value we place on women's appearance versus women's health and well-being. You've discovered tonight that Victorian women were not passively victimized by beauty standards. They actively participated in beauty culture, made choices about which practices to follow, and sometimes resisted standards they found too harmful. But their choices were made within a system that gave them limited options, that made beauty essential to their economic survival and social success, that provided medical and scientific authority for harmful practices, and that framed self-sacrifice for beauty as feminine virtue. You've learned about the specific practices Victorian women used to achieve fashionable beauty: arsenic for pale skin, vinegar for thinness, belladonna for luminous eyes, tight lacing for tiny waists, and deliberate cultivation of the appearance of illness and fragility. You've learned about the real health consequences of these practices: poisoning, malnutrition, organ damage, blindness, permanent skeletal deformation, and premature death. You've learned about how doctors, beauty experts, and society generally enabled and encouraged these harmful practices through medical authority, pseudo-scientific claims, and rhetoric that framed beauty as duty and self-harm as virtue. You've also learned about the women who resisted these standards, who advocated for health over beauty, who challenged the system that made women's appearance more important than their well-being, and about the high social costs they paid for their resistance. You've learned about the class dimensions of beauty practices, how they functioned to signal and maintain class status, how families invested in daughters' beauty as an economic strategy, and you've learned about the connections between Victorian beauty culture and modern beauty standards. How many of the patterns established in the 19th century persist today in different forms. Thank you for spending this time learning about Victorian women and the beauty standards that shaped and damaged their lives. You now understand that beauty culture has always been more complex than simple vanity or self-expression. It has been bound up with economics, class, gender, power, and the fundamental question of what women are for and what they're worth. You understand that practices that seem obviously harmful in retrospect made sense to the people engaging in them within their social context, and that we should examine our own beauty practices with the same critical eye we bring to historical practices. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to think about the Victorian women who suffered for beauty, who made difficult choices within constrained options, who sometimes resisted and sometimes conformed, who were more than just victims of oppressive standards, but also agents trying to navigate systems they didn't create and couldn't fully escape. Think about what their stories reveal about the power of beauty standards to shape behavior, to make harmful practices seem reasonable, to convince people to damage themselves in pursuit of social acceptance and success. The next time you encounter beauty advice, beauty products, or beauty standards, remember what you learned tonight about arsenic and vinegar and tight lacing. Remember that practices that are widely accepted and heavily promoted can still be harmful. Remember that medical and scientific language doesn't automatically mean something is safe or beneficial. Remember that free choice doesn't mean no coercion when choices are made within systems that severely limit options. And remember that beauty culture has always existed in tension with health and well-being, and that prioritizing appearance over health is a pattern that has persisted across centuries, because the social systems that create and maintain beauty standards benefit from women's compliance with those standards regardless of the cost. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with deeper understanding of how beauty standards work, how they can harm even as they promise enhancement, and how important it is to maintain critical awareness of beauty culture and to prioritize your health and well-being over appearance standards that demand you damage yourself. May you remember that the Victorian women who drank poison for beauty were not foolish, but were trapped in a system that made beauty essential and health expendable, and that we have the opportunity to learn from their experiences and to challenge beauty standards that prioritize appearance over well-being. Rest well, knowing that beauty standards are constructed and changeable, that what one era considers beautiful, another finds harmful or ridiculous, that your worth is not determined by your appearance, and that taking care of your health is more important than conforming to any beauty standard. The Victorian women who suffered for beauty didn't have the option to simply opt out of beauty culture. Their economic survival and social position depended on their appearance in ways that severely limited their choices. We have more options than they did, and we can honor their memory by using those options to prioritize health over harmful beauty practices, to challenge beauty standards that demand self-sacrifice, and to recognize beauty culture for what it is, a system that benefits from women's insecurity and compliance, not a neutral set of preferences or natural standards. May you sleep peacefully tonight, carrying with you the knowledge that beauty is not worth suffering for, that health is more valuable than appearance, that you deserve to take up space and be well fed and comfortable in your body, regardless of whether that body meets current beauty standards. May you remember the Victorian women who crushed their organs and poisoned themselves and starved themselves for beauty, and may their suffering inspire you to resist beauty standards that demand you harm yourself. And may you wake tomorrow with renewed commitment to treating your body with kindness, to nourishing rather than depriving yourself, to prioritizing your well-being over your appearance, and to recognizing that you are valuable regardless of how closely you conform to beauty standards that are ultimately arbitrary, changeable, and often actively harmful. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with images of health, vitality, strength, and the freedom to exist in your body without constantly monitoring and modifying it to meet others' expectations. May you remember that every generation's beauty standards seem ridiculous to later generations, that what seems essential and natural now will seem arbitrary and strange to future people, and that you don't have to participate in practices that harm you just because they're currently fashionable or widely accepted. Sleep well, knowing that the most radical thing you can do in a culture that profits from your self-hatred is to be at peace with yourself as you are, to care for your health, and to refuse to sacrifice your well-being for beauty. Sweet dreams, and good night.